Well, thank you for coming. It's really great to be here at the Alan Turing Institute. My name's Matt Clifford. I'm the founder and CEO of Entrepreneur First, which is a company that I started with my co-founder Alice 5 years ago to support more of the world's best technologists to start companies. And what we're going to try and do today is we've got about 3 hours and we're going to try and give a brief but nevertheless as comprehensive as possible tour of three key aspects of starting companies, of the entrepreneurial journey. I'm going to kick off with about half an hour, 45 minutes on why I think people like you might want to start companies one day. And then we're going to do a longer session in the middle of just over an hour, which will look at very practically how to start a business, how to test ideas, how to validate them, how to generate them in the first place. And then we're going to wrap up again with a shorter session, this time looking at what actually is a startup, what happens to them, what's the journey that an entrepreneur goes through. I'm going to leave lots of time at various points for questions. It's also going to be lots of time for you to talk to each other and to us about ideas and that sort of thing. So hopefully you will find it interesting, and hopefully have lots of chance to talk about some of the things you're working on as well. Just before we kick off, though, it would be good to get a quick sense of who's in the room. So hands up if you have ever thought about starting a business before. Okay. Hands up if you think that you will start a business one day. Okay, excellent. Hands up if you've ever heard of Entrepreneur First before. Okay, that's great. Okay, so what I want to do to kick off is try and motivate a bit this whole idea of startups and entrepreneurship. And in particular, there's a reason why I'm here today and not kind of speaking to a group of history PhDs, and that is because I believe that actually data science is one of the most exciting frontiers in entrepreneurship right now. It's one of the areas with the most possibilities open, and I think that people like you and your peers and the people that you meet in your work are actually probably one of the groups of people that should be most alive and interested in what's actually happening out there right now. Some of what I'm going to say I think will be very familiar. Some of it I hope is new. Please feel free to kind of interrupt me as we go, ask questions. We do have time set aside at the end for questions, but very happy for you to ask questions as you go. So first, I should declare my bias, which is my company, Entrepreneur First, has as basically its founding belief this idea that the world is changing very fast. And one of the things that changes as the world changes is careers, and in particular, what ambitious people do with their lives. And what we've built at EF is a program and a community that revolves around this idea, that the more ambitious you are, the more you should want to start a business. And in fact, that today represents an unprecedented opportunity for people with the sorts of skills that you have to build something substantial and lasting and meaningful through entrepreneurship. And what I'm going to try and demonstrate over the next half hour, 45 minutes, is why this is the case, why this has changed, and what sorts of opportunities might be open to you. A little bit just to put that in context about me and about EF. So I trained as a statistician at MIT, and then I went to become a management consultant here in London at McKinsey, which is a big consultancy. And as I like to tell people, I did that really not from any desire to be a management consultant. I never, when I was this high, ran around saying, Mummy, I really want to be a management consultant one day. I really want to learn all the PowerPoint shortcuts. That would be great. In fact, I had no idea what I wanted to do with my career. But one of the beliefs that inspired us to build Entrepreneur First is the idea that in every society throughout history, there have been a set of what I would call default career paths. They're career paths that people take as almost a path of least resistance. And actually what I believe is that each society, each economy is really shaped by what ambitious people choose to do as their default career paths. And I'm sure in your home universities there are big careers fairs every year. I'm sure if you wander around them, you will see the same names come up on the banners of people trying to recruit people like you. And in the UK, and in fact in Europe more broadly, for a very long time, these like default paths have been things like banking. I'm sure there are no shortage of banks at your universities trying to snap you up. They're consulting, professional services. And one of the things that I think is really exciting about Silicon Valley is that it's one place where that's not the case, where default career paths have actually been about building things, about building companies, building products, building technology. And what our mission is at Entrepreneur First is to try and inject a little bit of that culture into Europe. So we've been doing it a little while, and fortunately it's worked reasonably well. We have built about 100 companies over the last 4 years. By built, what I mean is we found the founders as individuals, we brought them together, we helped them develop an idea, we invested in those companies, and then we helped grow them. And those companies today are worth about $500 million. Some of them have done very well and have already exited. Had one of the biggest machine learning exits of 2016 when a company that we helped build called Magic Pony Technology was bought by Twitter, which was very exciting for us as a team that we'd built at EF. And in fact, we've actually made more investments in companies that have machine learning or some variant of machine learning as the core technology than any other firm in Europe. So we've seen a lot of companies being built over the last 4 years with the kinds of technologies that you work in at their very core. So that's why when we look at kind of the work that the ATI is doing and we look at the work that you're doing, we see a huge possibility not just to further the boundaries and frontiers of science, but also to actually find ways to build the things that you're discovering into products that have a meaningful impact across the whole economy and society, to create jobs, to create growth. And we think that that opportunity is really unprecedented. So let's think about why anyone would start a startup. So for those of you who have put your hand up when I said who's thinking that they might do one day, what reasons would you have for starting a company? There are no wrong answers.
I'm very passionate about certain issues.
Right? Exactly, yes. So if you're passionate about a certain issue, a company can be a really great vehicle for following that passion. Absolutely agree. That's the number one reason I would say. It's the reason I started my company. Any other reasons?
Freedom. You can kind of create your own path.
Absolutely, yes. So the difference between working in a large company or in a big bureaucracy or similar versus starting your own is hugely different in terms of autonomy, in terms of freedom. Anything else?
Make lots of money.
Certainly, when you succeed, you can make lots and lots of money. I think I always warn people that the mean expected return of starting a company may be very high, but the median expected return is very low. So you should be very careful with that as a motivation, but it'd be foolish to pretend that that isn't a motivation. Anything else? The only other one that really comes to mind that I think a lot of people think of is an opportunity to build the future. In general, companies working at the frontiers of technology, when they succeed, they not only generate a lot of wealth for their founders and their investors and give a lot of freedom to those people and allow them to follow their passions, but they actually allow them to shape the world that we live in. And I think we have seen over the last 20 years that explode to a huge extent. I just want to walk through some really familiar examples of how quickly new technologies are allowing startups, new companies to shape the future. I think and maybe even hope that most of these examples will be extremely obvious to you, but what I want to kind of bring to the surface is why now this moment in history, 2016, represents this moment that probably simply wasn't true 30 years ago. I don't think it would have made sense for me 30 years ago, partly because I was just born, to stand in this room and give this talk 30 years ago. So I think there are several reasons why it's the best time in human history to be a technology entrepreneur. Let's walk through a few examples. So one of the most famous examples of technological disruption, by which I mean the kind of breaking of old models and old ways of doing things, is the story of Kodak. Kodak was not only one of the largest companies in the world, not only one of the largest and most innovative photography companies in the world, but in its day, in its founding moment, Kodak was a great innovator. That is how Kodak became a big success. And now, as all of you, I think, will know, or at least it won't be a surprise to hear that Kodak is bankrupt. Kodak no longer is a powerhouse of the economy. Why? Well, basically because there are now more photos taken every day on these things than were taken in the whole history of photography before 2007. Isn't that extraordinary? Every year, more photos taken on smartphones than were taken before 2007 in total. And so this photography company, Instagram, many of you will use or at least will have seen, now has more interaction with, I suppose, the photographic needs of people, what people actually want to take pictures of, how people want to experience photography than Kodak ever had in its long, long history. A really obvious example, but a really striking one. Technology that's only really just become possible, exploding in popularity, exploding in usage, and in its wake, actually disrupting a traditional way of doing things. Another one, taxis. You know, the iconic London cab, one of the most important symbols of London. But actually, if you zoom out and if you ignore cabs and just think about driving, truck driving, I believe, is the single largest sector of employment in the US. It's extraordinary. Driving as a way of life is totally obvious to us. I learned to drive when I was, I think, 17, thinking that it was an absolute must for my future. And now that I've moved to London, I don't have a car, and I haven't driven, I think, for about 10 years, and I probably never will. And partly because of the existence of companies like Uber. Uber is eating and destroying the taxi industry. There's a remarkable fact about Uber. I presume everyone is familiar with Uber. Uber obviously is a hail a car from your phone app. And what is amazing about Uber is not only the way that it's disrupting the traditional model of the taxi industry, but the way it is actually recreating that industry. Uber's revenues in San Francisco today are 3 times higher than the entire taxi industries were in San Francisco in the year that Uber was founded. In other words, Uber is not just replacing taxis, it's totally changing the way people think about driving. And now Uber announces that in the future its goal is to have the same fleet of cars, but no drivers. All these taxis, these Uber cabs, will be driverless. Again, it will totally redefine and reinvent what it means to travel, what transport means to us. Instead of being your car and driving being a part of your identity, as maybe it's never been like that in the UK, but certainly it has in the US for a long time, that's going to hugely disrupt that way of life. And then we have to think about what's going to happen to all the people who were drivers professionally. Huge change. And, you know, talking about in very neutral terms, now is we can talk about whether these are good things or bad things, but the point is that this company is only 8 years old, less than 8 years old. It was founded in 2009. It's only just become possible because of the density of smartphone ownership and use, and it's disrupting vast swathes of life. Thomas Cook, a huge travel agent, publicly listed company that's in trouble because of places like Airbnb. Airbnb today, which owns not a single building, maybe its own office perhaps, probably leases that, owns not a single hotel, not a single room, has more rooms listed on its website every night than any other hotel chain in the world, and it's worth more on paper than any other hotel chain in the world. Again, kind of technology that's only just become possible in terms of in usage and penetration, disrupting existing ways of life. Blockbuster, one of the most famous victims of the internet age. Blockbuster was the iconic brand of home entertainment. And now, of course, Netflix has eaten its lunch. Blockbuster, like Kodak, bankrupt and a victim of the internet economy. And these are just the ones that are obvious now. What's really striking about technological disruption is that it only becomes obvious really too late. You should read the analyst reports on Blockbuster from before it went bust, and how Netflix, this crazy thing, that didn't matter. That was going to be gone. That was a kind of fly-by-night brand that no one needed to worry about. Sainsbury's perhaps will be disrupted by things like Amazon Prime now. You can now have delivered in an hour your groceries. And this one has not yet happened, but people are now talking about printed pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceuticals that can be printed down in your local pharmacy rather than created in the traditional way by huge pharmaceutical companies. What will that disruption look like 5 years down the line? I don't know, but the point is that we're right now standing in a place where the power to create things with technology, which is only just becoming possible, is having repercussions and impact way beyond what we might have traditionally thought of as the technology industry. The technology industry doesn't really make sense as a categorization anymore. Someone said to me recently that we'll soon stop talking about tech companies because it won't make sense in the same way that you would never describe a supermarket as an electricity company because it has light bulbs. In fact, technology is going to be so core to everything that's happening that to talk about a tech company will no longer make sense. So why is this happening? Why is now such an extraordinary time to be an entrepreneur? Well, partly it's because I think that it's not just that there are these big companies that are employing technology to disrupt other big companies. The most exciting thing about the disruptors that we just walked through quickly is that they were actually started with relatively little capital by relatively few individuals and relatively few natural advantages. This is not a story of two big beasts fighting each other and the tech one winning. This is actually a story of relatively ordinary people with relatively small sets of resources being able to change the world through applying technology in a smart way. And that is really what's new, is the nature of how technology is invented and deployed. And it's one of the reasons that we're so excited to work with the ATI is because actually I think the next wave of technologies that are going to have this disruptive potential are the kinds that are going to be created here on places like here on relatively small budgets by relatively small numbers of people. So I firmly believe that there are kind of three factors that determine what happens in sort of technological revolutions. Three factors that determine people's choices of what to do with their lives and how to spend their time, how to spend their lives. And those three factors are impact, scope, and cost. What do I mean by that? Well, impact, I think, is a very broad term. What I mean by it is a very broad term to describe what ambitious people are seeking. And if you have a conversation with someone who really is ambitious, what it comes down to when you really probe is they want to have impact beyond themselves. They want to do something that affects the world, that affects people around them. Now, what that might mean could be extremely broad. It could mean making lots of money. It could mean changing the way that people live. It could mean all sorts of different things. But the key idea of impact is that impact is about scale. You want to have impact beyond yourself. I often joke to groups like this that if we were standing in the equivalent setting 1,000 years ago, it wouldn't be in a data science institute, but in a monastery, and you'd all be learning to be monks. And why would you all be learning to be monks? Because actually, in the 11th century, learning to be a monk was a great way to have impact beyond yourself. That might seem totally crazy, but there was this amazing new technology that had been invented in the 11th century, which was an incredible tool for impact, unprecedented in human history. And the Matt Clifford of 1016 would have been preaching the virtues of this new technology called literacy. It was taking the world by storm. The idea that you could store in writing ideas that then could be transmitted by copying in a scriptorium in a monastery. This was revolutionary. I can see you're unmoved by the idea of becoming monks. That's fine. But the point is that through history, different technologies have been the key to being able to scale your impact. What literacy was once, I believe probably data science is today. It's a technology that allows you to scale your impact beyond wherever you work. Let me give an example of why this has just happened so quickly and why, although the 1016 revolution in literacy was a big deal, it didn't have quite the same explosive impact that I think that the digital revolution has had over the last 15, 20 years. It's really because the ability of technology to scale now is so much greater than it was with when monks had to copy out by hand vast tomes in libraries. So look at this, these axes. You see here we have millions of people going from 0 to 5,000 million or 5 billion people, and here we have years. And what I want to show you is just how explosively the two most important technologies I think of the last 20 years have been relative to anything else in human history. So first thing I want to talk about is the number of people who are online, people who had internet access. How many people had internet access in 1995, do you think, roughly? Pardon?
What did you define as the internet?
had access in their kind of day-to-day life to a machine that could connect to the internet. Few million. Okay. Any other guesses? Yeah, it's a good guess. It was about 50 million. About 50 million people could access the internet in 1995. Now, we now look at that and we kind of laugh. It seems like the impossibly early days of the internet, the kind of caveman era of the internet. But actually, can you imagine being alive in 1995 and looking at those 50 million and being like, wow, this is an unprecedented opportunity in human history. I can access 50 million people remotely. It's like a market almost the size of the UK of just people online. It would have seemed like an extraordinary opportunity. And yet, by 2000, there were 500 million people online. The market had grown tenfold in such a short period of time. It must have seemed in 2000, in fact it did, this is why we had the dot-com boom, swiftly followed by the bust, that this was an unprecedented opportunity in human history. There are 500, anyway, you get the drill. But then by 2014, there are nearly 3 billion people online. Again, relative to 2000, this must have seemed, in fact it did, like an unprecedented boom. 3 million people who could be accessed from your bedroom, more or less, with products that could spread worldwide, literally at the speed of thought. Fast forward to 2020, and we're looking at a world where we have 4 billion people online. This is a totally extraordinary explosion of potential, the ability to reach these people. I often say that if you think about Mark Zuckerberg and the power and influence he has by being able to control a service that 1.8 billion people use every day, it is really, really unusual, probably unprecedented in human history. I like to say that if Napoleon could see Mark Zuckerberg, he would be extremely envious of the amount of power that this guy had. And he didn't even have to raise an army to do it. He literally just built a product in his bedroom that today can reach billions of people. Okay, so the speed of the explosion of internet access has been pretty impressive. But actually, there's one technology whose explosion has dwarfed that of conventional internet access. And that's people who have access to a smartphone. Smartphone with internet access. So in 1995, how many people had access to a smartphone with internet access? 0, right? In 2000, how many people had access to a smartphone with internet access? 0. Near enough. By 2014, it was 2 billion. 2 billion people from a standing start where the number had been 0 in 2000 had access to a smartphone. By 2020, it would be 4 billion. 4 billion people have access to the internet through a smartphone. And what's really exciting is they're not the same 4 billion people. In fact, smartphone penetration is disproportionately high in places that have been traditionally cut off from the global economy. If you go to sub-Saharan Africa and look at smartphone penetration there, it's extraordinarily high. And what that means is that people who have the skills to build products and services that are delivered over the internet and that are kind of disproportionately powerful in a digital sense, relative to any other actor in human history before about the year 2000, your ability to reach people and have a positive impact in their lives is extraordinarily high. Maybe that seems a totally trivial point, but if you were to ask me to sum up in one sentence why now is the best time to be a technology entrepreneur, I'd simply say because more people can use your stuff. Relative to any other entrepreneur in any other sector in all human history, more people can use your stuff today if you build products and services that can be delivered over the internet. And what that means is that the scope of what is possible through technology is higher today. As I said, like we used to think very much of a technology industry, and we thought of companies like IBM or Oracle. Today, as we've already talked about, nearly every sector of the economy, nearly every aspect of society is being changed by the application of digital technologies. Uber, now the biggest taxi company in the world. If you'd said to someone 10 years ago that software would eat taxis, they would have thought that was crazy. Airbnb, now the biggest hospitality chain in the world. If you said that software would eat hospitality, that would have seemed crazy. Maybe a slightly less well-known example, Climate Corporation, a data science company that looks at weather and agriculture, that ultimately was bought by one of the largest agriculture companies in the world for over $1 billion. That's having an impact on another area that seemed totally impenetrable to technology, agriculture. So software, this is a phrase used by Mark Andreessen, who was the creator of the first browser, first kind of public browser for the web, Mosaic. He says software is eating the world. And he's right. What he means is that every aspect of life is becoming more and more influenced by software, by digital technologies. So we have unprecedented scale, you can reach more people. Unprecedented scope, you can do more things that are influenced by digital technologies. The third piece is that the barriers to actually getting started for ordinary people, and by ordinary people I mean people without access to large amounts of capital, those barriers have never been lower. It has never been cheaper to get started in technology, and it's never been cheaper to get started in entrepreneurship. Does anyone know who this guy is? I didn't until I Googled him, but this is James Pierpont Morgan, JP Morgan, the founder of the JP Morgan Bank, and actually of Morgan Stanley. They had to be split because he was too successful an entrepreneur. It was seen as dangerous and anti-competitive. How did he get to be so rich? Basically by writing checks. The technology of scale for someone born, who was active basically 100 years ago, was to write checks to other people. It was to own the amount of capital that would enable other people to be entrepreneurs. That model is gone. That model is old. That model is not where influence comes from today, where entrepreneurship comes from today. The person that you'll definitely recognize is this guy, Mark Zuckerberg. Writing code is the new writing checks. Karl Marx talked about the means of production and how important that was to a society. Who owned the means of production? The means of production today is a laptop or a smartphone. Mark Zuckerberg needed zero capital to get started to build the first version of Facebook at Harvard back in 2004. He had the power to build Facebook because of what he could do, not because of what checks he could write. And that is the key revolution that means that not only is the opportunity bigger than ever before to become an entrepreneur, but the ability to become one is greater than ever before. The amount of money that you need to get started now is covered if you have a laptop, a Wi-Fi connection, and can feed yourself. Well, you probably need somewhere to sleep as well. But a few essentials otherwise. Writing code is the new writing checks. Why is that? Partly because of things like open source software. This is the GitHub logo. Many of you will have used GitHub, or at least have heard of GitHub. One of the reasons that it's never been cheaper to start a technology company is you don't have to write all the code yourself even. In fact, I can't imagine, as I said, we've helped build 100 companies at Entrepreneur First. I can't imagine that a single one of them doesn't use open source software one way or another, doesn't make use of contributions that other people have made. And in fact, many of them also make contributions themselves. Many of them are built on their own software being open source. This radically changes the equation, the cost equation of starting a business. Instead of having to do everything yourself in-house, instead you can rely on the fact that other people have been there before. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can instead see innovation as a building block that builds on other building blocks. And this has radically reduced the cost of innovation and meant that ordinary people who don't have access to large teams of developers, in fact, very often are the only developers in their organization themselves, they too can innovate at scale. In fact, data science is a great example of this. Many of the incremental innovations in some of our most exciting data science and machine learning companies basically take as given almost all the software stack and just build on the very top. That might seem like a very small thing, but it totally transforms the economics of starting a company because you don't have to start from scratch. Not only that, but probably the most important innovation that has fueled the startup boom, the entrepreneurship boom, is Amazon Web Services. For those of you who don't know, and I'm sure you all do, Amazon Web Services effectively is a set of services that Amazon provides to allow you to host your website, host your any storage needs you have, any compute needs you have on their servers. In fact, it's been so successful that even some of the world's largest companies don't bother having their own data centers anymore. They use Amazon. Netflix, which is the heaviest user of internet bandwidth in the world, at peak, a third of internet traffic is just people watching Netflix. They are entirely hosted on Amazon Web Services. Why is this a revolution? Because it used to be that one of the biggest startup costs of getting started as an entrepreneur was buying servers physically. A friend of ours is the founder of Betfair, which he started in 1997. And he tells this story that when he started it, before he actually got going full-time on the business, he had to raise $1 million so that he could buy the servers that Betfair was going to run on. if you compare that 20 years on, in 2016, Entrepreneur First, Amazon and Google and Microsoft come into our offices and compete to give away their service for free. It's a totally different world. Power has shifted from capital to entrepreneurs. No longer do you need these vast sums of money to get started. People will pay you to get started. In a way, Entrepreneur First itself is an example of that. We pay people to come and find out whether they should be entrepreneurs. And so when you look at this, this whole thing as an equation, what you're seeing is that the economic cost of getting started as an entrepreneur has never been lower. What's really interesting is it's not just financial cost that's fallen, it's reputational cost. It used to be, maybe even 10 or 15 years ago, that one of the reasons that people who kind of had ideas and were interested in being entrepreneurs didn't start businesses is they thought that if they failed, that would be it. Black mark against their name. It's all over. Nothing could be further from the truth today. Today, both in the UK and more broadly in Europe and actually across the world, there are ecosystems of support of people who love to work with people who've tried to build something and it's not worked. In fact, that's no longer seen as a black mark, but as a positive benefit. Our companies, the 100 companies that we've worked with, they love hiring people who are former entrepreneurs. So actually, in terms of career acceleration, it's really changed completely the calculation that you have to make. No longer is it this tremendous risk that if you fail, you've lost everything. Instead, you've probably got less capital and less reputation at stake than ever before. And so when you take all these things together, I think it adds up to something that looks like a very different world. In fact, I think that when you have a world where more scale is possible through entrepreneurship than ever before, a broader range of applications is possible than ever before, and the cost is lower than ever before, what we see every day at EF and what we see around the world, we have an office in Singapore, we do work in the US, we're seeing that the kind of people who want to be entrepreneurs and the number of those people has grown unbelievably over the last even 5 years that we've been doing this. And so I think we have to prepare for a world where entrepreneurship goes from being a weird thing, like a fringe pursuit for a tiny minority of people, to something that is increasingly normal, increasingly standard, something that doesn't freak your parents out when you tell them that you're considering it, but instead seems to be almost an obvious or sensible choice. And I think we need, in a way, to rethink what the world looks like, where instead of it being a minority pursuit, it becomes very much a normal pursuit. I'm going to stop there for now. That was my whistle-stop tour on why now for starting a startup. Does anyone have any questions on that before we move on?
Well, you say more entrepreneurs, that means more competition as well, right?
That's true. That's true. It does mean more competition. I think what's really interesting, and we'll talk about this a lot when we talk about how to assess ideas. What's interesting about competition in startups is that actually, to begin with, your biggest competition is people not caring rather than people caring too much. So far at EF, we haven't had a single company die because of competition. We've had many, many die because their customers didn't actually want what the company was trying to build. And actually, that's what the second part of the talk is about, is how to avoid building something that no one wants. Now, I do think that it's true that competition will intensify higher up the food chain. And maybe this is too cynical a way of looking at it, but this actually can also be good news for entrepreneurs. So the company I was telling you about briefly earlier, Magic Pony Technology, which Twitter bought earlier this year, Twitter ended up paying $150 million for that, for a company that was only about 18 months old. One of the reasons was that the competition in that space, in the deep learning for video space, had hotted up so much that they desperately thought they needed it, and they were competing with other companies to buy it. And so actually, I think for startups that are nimble enough to navigate the extremely complex, often nuanced, often unpredictable world of technology innovation, are probably not the ones who have the most to fear from competition. Although you're right, there is nothing easy about startups. I can promise you that one of the conclusions you will not take away from today is, wow, it's so easy. There's just money out there to be made, just sitting around, pick it up. Sadly, not as simple as that, but I think you're probably right.
Do you think it is a common objective in founders to want to be acquired by tech giants?
I think at the start, the answer is usually no. So very few people that we work with go into the process of starting a company thinking, hopefully Google will buy us. And that's good. It's good for people like me that invest in startups, because we'd much prefer that these companies became big, independent. They became the Googles that were going to buy the other companies. What I would say, though, is that as you go on through your entrepreneurial journey, your incentives start to change. And after you've done 5 years of hard slog in one domain, you might start to think, actually, Google or Facebook or Twitter or Microsoft riding in and writing me a big check suddenly doesn't feel like such a bad thing. What I would say more broadly, though, is that motivation really does matter for entrepreneurship. And one thing I've seen is that actually the people who get into entrepreneurship thinking it's a great way to make money usually, or seem to do worse on average than the people who get in because they're passionate about either a particular technology or a particular poor guy, or a particular way of changing the world. And the reason, I'll talk about this a little bit later, but I think the reason for that is that starting a startup is so hard, and there are so many challenges along the way, many of which are unexpected, that if you get into it purely to make money, at some point you think, you know what, there are a lot of easier ways of making money than this. Whereas if you get in it to build something because you want something to exist and it doesn't exist yet, then actually that as a motivation, I think, carries you a lot further through the really tough times than let's go make money. I mean, let's face it, anyone with a PhD in the sorts of things that you have PhDs in or will have PhDs in is not going to struggle for employment opportunities. So really it has to be, I think, a labour of love in some ways. It has to be something where you think, you know, I want this to exist so much that I'm willing to do this, take this path. So sometimes we see these acquirers as white knights, but I don't think it's sensible to start the journey with that mindset.
The kind of founders you work with, do they come mostly from a technical background, or do they also come from a different background?
It's a great question that I should have said right at the start. So Entrepreneur First has an unusual model in many respects, and I will talk about it right at the end, but everyone that we take on to EF starts as an individual. So unlike nearly every other sort of similar incubator, if you like, we don't invest in companies that already exist. All the companies are built, and we start with individuals. And very unusually, we start with 95% of the individuals have a tech background. We really believe in that. And mainly for the reasons that I was sort of outlining. I believe that one of the reasons that technology entrepreneurship is now so attractive is that you can be your own means of production. You don't need a factory. You don't need a heavy manufacturing plant. You can build it yourself. And so I really believe that starting with people who are able to build the products, or at least contribute to the products, is a big part of why we've been quite successful. I also think that, and this is more of an ideological point, but it's about time that kind of business people stopped putting tech people in the corner. It's crazy to me that there should be seen as a division between those two groups. There's no reason why people with computer science or data science backgrounds can't be CEOs and business people. Even if you talk to great business people, they very seldom will say, well, yeah, I learned everything I knew about business doing my MBA. In fact, they'll say, I learned everything I know about business doing business. So one of the kind of things that we exist to do is to train people with tech backgrounds to think like CEOs and to be business people. And actually, I think if you look at the history of Silicon Valley and the really great successes, the Microsofts, the Facebooks, the Googles, they were started by tech people who became great business people. I always say that the funniest thing is, people say, oh yeah, but Larry Page, when he was founding Google, he brought in a business guy to run it, Eric Schmidt. It's like, yeah, but Eric Schmidt has a PhD in computer science. He's hardly your standard business guy. So yeah, we're almost 100% focused on tech, and the few people, the 5% that we bring in who don't have tech backgrounds, they're not business people as such. They're actually people with what we would call deep domain expertise. So they're people who know something about an industry or a sector that we think is going to be really transformed by technology. What they're bringing to the table is not strategy, finance, marketing. I'll give you an example. One of the people we're interviewing for the next cohort is a dentist. She has some really interesting ideas about how dentistry is going to be affected by technology. Now, she doesn't have an MBA. I don't think she knows anything about business in the traditional sense, but what she knows a lot about is dentistry. So you can imagine her teaming up with someone with a deep tech background and actually come up with something really interesting there. This sort of middle section is designed to be really practical. And sorry, what was your name? Dave. So Dave asked, how does Entrepreneur First work? Well, it's a 6-month program, but in the next 75 minutes, I'm going to try and compress everything we've learned in the last 5 years and everything that we do over 6 months into this session. And what the aim of this session is to, one, tell you how we think about idea generation at EF. 2, to give you an opportunity to actually think about what, if you were to start a startup, and obviously you're all doing a PhD, so I'm not suggesting you would do it now, but how you would go about generating ideas given who you are and what you know. And 3rd, to think about how you actually would get started beyond this. So hopefully something interesting will come out of this. And obviously it's going to be slightly, again, sort of whistle-stop tour, but I hope that it will be fun. So, Dave just asked about the very start of EF's journey 5 years ago, and correctly pointed out that when I started this with Alice, I'd never built a company before, never worked in tech before, never invested in a company before, never worked in venture capital before, and indeed was totally unqualified to do this. However, I think although that was quite difficult in some ways, it became a big advantage, because what we do at EF is really very much in defiance of conventional wisdom from the kind of technology industry and from the venture capital industry about how companies are built. And what that meant was that when we started to think about how would you build large numbers of companies from scratch every year, we had to really invent that process completely from a blank sheet of paper. And what that meant was that we were able to really experiment and try things that at the time seemed quite radical and quite unusual, but now that we're 100 companies in, start to feel like they really work. So I'm going to try and outline what that means and how we think about building companies from scratch. So the first step is generating ideas. Now, one of the occupational hazards of investing in a lot of companies is that it means that every friend, every relative, every acquaintance that I have now, whenever I see them, says either, I have this great startup idea, what do you think? Or, my friend has this great startup idea, what do you think? And obviously I'm more than happy to listen to startup ideas. But I would say what this exercise shows me is that most people have no idea, A, how to come up with startup ideas, and B, how to tell a good one from a bad one. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's no reason why they should. I'm very fortunate to do this for a living. And what I want to try and get across now is a sort of somewhat repeatable framework for thinking about this topic. Now, I'm not going to try and pretend that startup idea generation is a science that you can just put through a machine, turn the handle and great ideas come out. But I think you can get to the point where you can more reliably come up with good ideas and more reliably root out bad ideas if you follow broadly the framework that I'm about to describe. Now, at Entrepreneur First, we have this word that we use all the time. It's absolutely central to our selection process, to our recruitment process, to our team building process, to our idea generating process, to our investment process. And that word is edge. Edge-based ideation. In fact, everything at EF is edge-based. And it's a word that obviously we didn't make up, but I feel we've very much kind of taken on and tried to possess as our own. Edge-based ideation is absolutely critical, and it's particularly critical, we find, for people like you who have research or academic backgrounds, because this is, as I hope you're about to see, the essence of your competitive advantage when it comes to starting a startup. Because when I talk about edge, what I really mean by the word edge is competitive advantage. So you may well have heard people say, oh, I've got an edge because, meaning I have a competitive advantage. And we believe this is absolutely crucial to any startup idea that you generate, is you shouldn't even bother starting a company, shouldn't even bother starting an idea unless you have a genuine competitive advantage in that idea. I'm going to spend the rest of the time explaining what that means because there's a lot to unpack there. But I'm going to keep coming back to this idea of edge. You do, whether you know it or not, you have an edge, and that edge needs to be at the heart of what kinds of ideas you start to generate what kinds of startups you build. First, let me explain why we believe so strongly in this idea of edge-based ideation. There is this common idea, this common kind of almost like myth of how great startups are built, and it goes something like this. Great entrepreneur wakes up one morning, gets in the shower, is humming away when a light bulb goes on above his or her head, and they suddenly have the great idea. And the great idea is born, and then the entrepreneur takes that idea and turns it into a company, and suddenly they're a billionaire. That is sort of like the popular myth of startups, that there are these light bulb moments. And it's amazing how persistent this myth is. So much so that whenever I see journalists interview entrepreneurs, they always ask questions like, what was the moment when? And the answer to that is almost always, there was not one moment when. That is not how ideas work. You can forget about a light bulb moment. And that's really important because it's also the answer to the question, but how could I start a startup? Because I don't have a great startup idea. I would really encourage you not to think of starting a startup as being about having a great idea and then starting a startup. Instead, I'd encourage you to think about an idea as something that develops, something that iterates, and something that you actually discover through the process of getting started. Now, obviously, it doesn't mean that you start with a blank sheet of paper, but I would really encourage you to get away from the idea of light bulb moments. That's a myth. I've never seen it happen. I'm really fortunate to have been involved in some really successful companies, but none of them had a light bulb moment. All of them went through a journey and a process. So we see instead that ideas should evolve organically from your edge, from your competitive advantage, from the thing, and by edge what I mean is the thing that you either know or can do or have experience in that sets you apart from other people. We'll dive into that a little bit more in a few minutes. But first, let me explain just 3 really important reasons why edge should be at the heart of any idea that you generate. The first is, as you already said, competition is really, really important. You know, ultimately, any good idea is not just a secret. It's, you know, the wrong metaphor is that a good idea is a needle in a haystack, and entrepreneurs search through the haystack and hopefully find that needle, and that is the good idea, and they won because they found that needle first. That's not how it works. Instead, ideas are really only good if they have just become possible. You know, it would not, if you came to pitch me afterwards and say, I had this great idea, people love fish and chips. So why don't we make a shop that just sells fish and chips to hungry people? I'd be like, I think people do love fish and chips, and I think a shop seems like a great way of delivering that to people. But that does not make a fish and chip shop a great startup idea. Why? Because so many people are already doing fish and chip shops, you're very unlikely to be able to have any sort of advantage of pricing or distribution or scale that hasn't already been achieved by the many, many millions of people who start fish and chip shops. And maybe that seems like a totally banal and obvious point, but it's amazing how many people think about startup ideas as things that sort of exist out there that you just need to take, grab, and execute. Instead, what you want to find is ideas that have just become possible, either because of a technological reason, like before this they simply couldn't have been made, or for a social reason, like preferences have changed, people want different things now, so until now it just wouldn't have been viable as an idea. So we're saying those first two are very interrelated. Technology changes preferences and preferences change technology. Or maybe demographic reasons, maybe who the market is has changed, maybe geographic reasons, maybe things that have worked in one place but for some reason not come over to another place have suddenly just become possible. But in general, the point is you can't think of these ideas as just needles in a haystack. They're only interesting if they've only just become possible, because otherwise your competitors would already be there doing it well. So when you think about a new idea, you better have an edge in that space. Otherwise, all the other people who are thinking about that idea at the same time will be better than you and they will win. That's a really important point. It's very, very rare for someone to have an idea that is so ahead of its time and yet viable that no one else in the world is thinking of doing it. In fact, I would say it's almost the opposite. It's an amazing kind of privilege that we have at EF, that we see literally thousands of people apply to us each year and tell us what they're interested in. And it's amazing how from 6 months to 6 month period, suddenly ideas pop up and seem to have spread like wildfire among large numbers of people, even though these people have never talked to each other. And the reason is that whenever something starts to become possible or viable and looks exciting, millions of smart people are attracted to that thing all at once. You know, when Uber showed that on-demand services through the smartphone was actually a really viable and lucrative opportunity, suddenly a lot of people start thinking about what other on-demand services could be delivered through a smartphone. That's not a crazy thought, that's a really good thought. But what it means is that uniqueness is not really going to be a thing in a world of 4, 5, 6, 7 billion people all trying to think of opportunities at the same time. Uniqueness is not your friend. It will not exist. So there will always be competition, which means that in any competitive environment, you want to have an edge. So, you know, to give real world examples, you know, if you have an edge in data science against most entrepreneurs, then you probably want to use that as some component of a startup idea that you work on, because all the other people who are working on that same idea, that is something that they're going to have in order to win. So edge is always going to give you an advantage over your competitors. And of course, the easiest way to see how important this is you certainly don't want to be at a disadvantage to your competitors. So in working from what you are already good at, what you already have a competitive advantage in, is the first reason why it's so important. The second is that being a founder is a really hard thing. It's really, really, really hard to start a company. Again, kind of to return to my theme, one of the conclusions from today is not going to be this is really easy and everyone should just go do it because there's just loads of money to be made. In fact, starting a startup is really tough. And because it's really tough, you're going to have to learn so much about almost every aspect of starting a business. One thing that has really shocked me over the last 5 years of building EF, and EF is still pretty small, we employ about 36 people in the UK and in Singapore, and you know, as I said, we've invested in about 100 companies, we've got about $100 million of funds under management. It's a small company in the scheme of things, but I'm constantly amazed at how complicated and hard it is just to run the business part of the business. Never mind the actual cool idea bit, just the business part. And so if you start a company, you're going to go on this learning journey of how to be a great founder. You're going to have to learn suddenly all this stuff that right now probably seems very nebulous to you around, you know, finance and HR and accounting and structure and management and leadership and all this stuff. Now, all that stuff is absolutely learnable. It shouldn't put you off. But the one thing you don't want to have to be going through this learning curve at is the basis of your idea. You want to be an expert in the space that you're coming up with the idea in. Otherwise, you're competing against people who have a head start with you. So again, just as edge, working on something that you know about, gives you a head start over your competition, it also gives you a head start in your own journey of becoming a better entrepreneur, becoming a better founder. So you really, really want to start with something where you know something. And finally, and we've already sort of touched on this, working on something that you know about means that you're more likely to care. If you just have an idea at random, if you have a light bulb moment and think, wouldn't it be great to have this like on-demand horse company where whenever you want a horse, you just press a button and a horse turns up outside. I don't know anything about horses, but you know, it seems like a really cool idea. There will probably become a point pretty quickly where you realize that there are major flaws with this idea. And you're not going to keep going because you knew nothing about it. It was a whim. Whims are a really, really bad idea in startups. In fact, you want what you build to come out of some deep knowledge or deep understanding, deep experience in an area, such that you're able to actually keep going when the going gets tough. And the more you're working on something where you have an edge, the more likely you are to have that intrinsic motivation rather than just thinking, hey, this is cool, or hey, this is how I can make a lot of money. So for those reasons, one of the kind of golden rules of EF is only work on ideas where you have an edge. Okay, I've talked a lot about edge now, so I'm going to dive into it a bit more. Like, how does this actually work? What does it actually mean? Well, here are 3 ways of thinking what your edge might be. Well, first is, what are the things that you know that few other people know? What are the things that you know that few other people know? Now, it's really important to qualify this. One thing that we've occasionally seen as a challenge, particularly with people who are in academia or are doing a PhD, is you might think, yeah, well, I do know a lot about this thing, but there are other people in my lab or there are other people at ATI who know even more than me. That does not disqualify you from doing this. What you're interested in is the pool of people who are starting companies, not the pool of all people in the world. If the bar to being an entrepreneur was being the world's #1 expert in a space, there would not be very many entrepreneurs. What you're interested in, again, comes back to this idea of competition, is how does what you know give you an edge compared to the other people starting a company in the space? So very often, when about 30 or 40% of the people who join EF come from an academic background, they've got a PhD, they've been doing a postdoc, something similar, they're almost always working on areas that they've become intimately knowledgeable about through their academic work. That's one way to think about what your edge is. A sort of related one, but subtly and importantly different, is what can you build that few other people can build? Most startup companies, at least the kind that we back at EF, are ultimately about products. They're ultimately about providing something that you can build once and copy many times and deliver all over a market, whether that's a country or a city or a world. So what is it that you can build? What is it that your work allows you to create that, again, relatively few other people are going to be able to create? And the third is, what do you understand? What are the insights you have into a problem that very few other people would have? So again, sometimes this might come out of your academic work, but sometimes it might come out of previous work experience or a hobby or something else that you spend a lot of time on. Very often, if there's an area of your life that you spend a lot of time in where you think, this problem is just broken, this situation is just wrong, and we could fix it, that's what we mean about a unique insight. Very often, you want to be the person that's like, wait a minute, it doesn't have to be this way, we could fix it. The important thing here is that the insight is genuinely rare. It can't just be that I say something like, oh, you know what really sucks? Alarm clocks, they're awful. I hate waking up in the morning. That should be a lot better. That is not an edge. I don't have any unique insight there over anyone else in the world who's woken by an alarm clock. What I'm really talking about is, if I have spent, as I have, 5 years in the venture capital business, then it might well be that I see particular problems in venture capital that need to be fixed. So edge can come out of something that you understand through your experience that other people are unlikely to understand. So just to recap, what do you know that other people don't know? What can you build that other people can't build? What do you understand, or what do you see that other people don't see? These are just the starting points for thinking about what your edge might be. And again, particularly in this context where you're all here in this one institute, you'll be very tempted to ignore your own expertise because you'll look around you and say, yeah, but these other people can do this too. Remember, this is a very unusual room and a very unusual group. And so you shouldn't dismiss your own edges simply because there are other people in the room that might have them. You've got to compare yourself to the pool of other people who are starting businesses. So we're going to do this short exercise. It'll take about 15 minutes, and it's hopefully, and I'll be around, and Elspeth and Jack from my team are here as well, so it's meant to be very interactive. It's not sort of like a suffer in silence workshop. I want to walk you through 4 questions that we get every single person that starts EF to work through as the basis of how they come up with ideas. And I want you to work through these. We're going to see at the end whether we can think of ideas that come out of the answers to these questions. So, first question is, what do you believe? Second question is, what is your hunch? Don't worry, I'm going to explain these. The third question is, how can you test this? Oh, there's only 3 questions, it turns out. Oh no, the first question is, what is your edge? Sorry, that's what happens when you double click. What is your edge? What do you believe? What is your hunch? And how can you test this? So let me work through these in turn. What is your edge? We've just been through this, but what I want you to think about is, given your background, your skills, your experience, what you're studying, what you're writing, what you're working on now, what is a plausible edge for you? What is it about you that could give you a competitive advantage? Either in the stuff you know, the stuff you can do, the stuff you can build, the insights that you have. I'm happy to kind of like chat to you one-on-one about this. We'll take about 20 minutes to do it. It's plenty of time. What is your edge? And just write down something. It doesn't, you know, there's no right or wrong answers. We'll work through this. Secondly, what do you believe? Now, the important thing about an edge isn't an idea. An edge isn't an idea at all. An edge is just a starting point for an idea. An edge is what guides you towards an idea, if you like. It's the landing lights that lead you towards the idea. The bit that takes us closer to an idea is, what does your edge cause you to believe? So one of the things that we say a lot at EF is, if it's truly an edge, it should mean that you have some beliefs about the world, either about what's possible or what's a problem or what's going to become possible in the near future, that other people won't share. One of the hard things about startups is that ultimately, if you think it's a good idea and everyone else thinks it's a good idea, it's automatically not a good idea. Because if everyone thinks it's a good idea, then the amount of competition is going to be horrible. So there has to be an element of contrarianism in a good startup idea. There has to be an element where you think it's a good idea and other people are like, I don't know. I'm not sure about that. This is a very uncomfortable space. It's very difficult to have an idea that you think is really good and everyone thinks is really bad. This absolutely happened to me and Alice at EF. I was just saying before in the break, we went to pitch every single investor more or less in London about this idea back in 2011, and not a single one wanted to fund it. Not a single person would fund EF. We had to go raise money from corporates as kind of corporate social responsibility sponsorship. And now we fortunately have lots of investors, and a lot of the same people who laughed us out of the room in the first year are now our investors. So you have to get comfortable with having beliefs that come from your edge that other people think are, if not crazy, then at least wrong. Or like, I'm not sure about that. So a question we get people to answer at EF is, what do you believe coming out of your edge that other people don't? Other people would think, it just seems wrong, or I'm not sure that's going to happen, or I'm not sure that's an opportunity. What are those beliefs? One way of thinking about this, if you're kind of struggling to think about this question, is what is the implication of your edge for, say, 5 years from now? 5 years from now, like how is the world going to be different 5 years from now? That's about the length of time it takes a startup to really get up to speed, 5 years. So how is the world going to be different in 5 years from now in a way that you think most people would disagree with? Okay. That belief should lead you to what we call at EF, a hunch. And the hunch is where we get really practical. So the hunch is saying, given what I say I believe, here is something that I could do now to take advantage of that. Let me try and be really practical. So we have this guy called Mark and this guy called Andy. And they joined EF last year, in fact, almost exactly a year ago, and they built this company called Context Scout. Now, Mark, some of you might even have met. He did his PhD in information retrieval at UCL, and he is really, really expert in kind of new methods of information retrieval. And his belief, which did seem totally crazy to us all at the time, was that, and remember I said it has to be an extreme belief that that most people disagree with. When he came to EF, he said that his work had led him to believe that Google, and indeed all search engines, would gradually become irrelevant over a 5-year period. He thinks that basically the idea of search is basically a very alien idea that we invented due to the limitations of our technology. But actually, like typing a query into a box and expecting answers to come is archaic. And instead, what we really need is context-based information retrieval. So rather than you having to think of what it is you want to search, your context should do most of the work for you. And the example he uses is if you are a recruiter looking at a LinkedIn profile, that might cause you to make a number of Google searches, like search for this person's name with name of a university to see whether they are listed on a university page. Search for the person's name and the name of a conference to see if they've ever presented at that conference. So Mark's argument is that if those searches are predictable, they're not really searches, they should just come from the context. In other words, knowing what's on that person's LinkedIn profile should cause you to want to pull in information from elsewhere that would otherwise be a search. And that context is a better user experience than search. You might be thinking, that's crazy. Good, that's what he wants you to think, because he doesn't want too much competition. So his belief, his edge was context-based information retrieval. His belief was that context-based information retrieval would render irrelevant search engines. His hunch was that it was possible to build for certain applications now a special purpose version of this. The reason I used recruiting is that was the area he started in. Could you build context-based information retrieval for recruiters so that simply by looking at someone's LinkedIn page, you could retrieve other information from across the web for the recruiter? And then the final question after what's your hunch is how do you test this? How do you actually check whether you were just... The trouble with things that sound crazy is that most of them are. That's the danger of startups. I'm telling you to come up with something that sounds crazy, but most of the time that just means it's crazy. So how do you actually test whether or not it's right or wrong? This is the key ingredient to actually getting started in startups, is coming up with sensible ways to test the hypotheses that you generate. So for Mark, his thing was to effectively build a sort of like dummy version of what became Context Scout for recruiters, where he would show basically mocked up pages of context-rich LinkedIn profiles, where he basically showed what it would look like if Context Scout existed and it had pulled in all this information from elsewhere on the web, and to give it as a demo to recruiters and see if they would sign up for a trial of this non-existent product. And many of them did. And that's how he proved to himself that it was worth actually building the technology to make it work. And since then, Context Scout's raised over $1 million of funding and is growing really well, and it's really exciting. But it really did come through working through these questions. What is his edge? What does he know a lot about? What is a belief that many people would disagree with, but that comes out of his edge? What is his hunch about how to get started with that? Like, what is his hunch that this means? And then how would he test this? And that's the process that every single entrepreneur at EF goes through. Edge, belief, hunch, test. So that's Mark and his co-founder Andy. Another example, so Peter here on the left of this photo, he finished his PhD in, I think almost exactly a year ago at Oxford, where he was working in the machine learning group, and he thought that his edge was actually that it was sort of a two-part thing, or it was at the intersection of two things. One, that he had a pretty deep background in various computer vision techniques, and second, that his mother is a senior radiologist and thinks her job is kind of crazy how unautomated it is. And so Peter thought his edge was basically in kind of practical machine learning for radiology, and that generated a belief, which was that it's now possible to augment radiologists' work to such an extent that you could make them 10 times more productive than they are now. And his hunch was that actually by working closely with his mother, who is a doctor in Hungary, he could get started in Hungary with a much easier to navigate environment than the NHS. And his test was to basically go to hospitals in Hungary and try and get them to agree to the sort of data sharing agreements that would be necessary in order to fuel this kind of work. And he did that, and he and his co-founder Sebastian, who also has a machine learning background, they did EF, and they just finished in September, and they've just received 3 offers of investment to take their company forward. Again, they had an edge, generated a belief, generated a hunch, and then ultimately generated a test, and then that's what they did with us over their time at EF. Okay, I don't want to labour the point. I think it's easier to just try this. So if you have a laptop, ideally, if you go to this address, we've set up a form which lays out these questions and should provide a little bit of context. And if you fill those in, what they will do is they'll come to us, and then we'll send you back both the slides and some thoughts on what you submit. So what I would suggest is, how are we doing for time? So we're running slightly behind. So what I would suggest is that we take about 5 minutes for you to, let's see how many of you are there. 1, 2. I think it's usually easier to do this after like 5 minutes discussion with each other. Because I think sometimes this feels like totally bizarre and alien, and how would you even start with a blank sheet of paper? So what I'd suggest is that you just pair up with whoever is nearest to you, and spend 5 minutes talking through these 4 questions with each other. Do you all know each other? But how well do you know each other? You all like friends-ish? Not enemies? Okay, good. What I'd suggest then is that you spend 5 minutes, and I'll keep time, talking to each other about what you think your edges are, what you think your beliefs are, hunches, and tests, and then fill in the form. We can come back together and talk through that a bit. Okay? Great. 5 minutes from now. So what we're going to do, just for those of you who are finished, once everyone's submitted them, we're going to ask a couple of people to talk through that and talk a little bit about what we would do if they were at EF, and how we'd start to think about testing. One thing that I think is really interesting, which we'll talk about a bit, is how the model within entrepreneurship has changed really over the last 15, 20 years to move to something that at least aesthetically sort of resembles the scientific method. I think it used to be that people said, cool, well, this entrepreneur has a great idea, let's give them a lot of money and let them go build it. And now we think much more about entrepreneurs generating hypotheses, testing the hypotheses as cheaply and quickly as possible in order for us to learn as much about the possibility and the opportunity as we can. So, last minute. So, does anyone who has submitted it want to tell us about their edge, belief, hunch test? Anyone? Yeah. What's your name, sorry? Pankaj. Go for it. No, you get going.
So I believe my edge is combining technical know-how about data science with a sense of design and aesthetics.
Okay. Excellent.
And about how to present and visualize information. My belief is that in this day of deluge of information and information overload, it's really important to be able to visualize information well. And my hunch is that it's possible for us to give tools to practitioners for them to be able to visualize their data in a better way and to uncover, to be able to make sense out of them.
When you say practitioners, do you mean data science practitioners?
Yes.
Yeah.
And even I also think that in terms of, for example, when we have search queries, it's not necessary that we get a list of results. It's possible to like present things in a better way. And okay, does this to take some use cases to visualize that information, show it to the practitioners and see if they find it useful, and ask for feedback if it really helped them. And if yes, then find a way of making this automatic generation.
Cool. That's a good start. That's amazing. Yeah, exactly. So we have an edge, which sounds very plausible. The intersection of data science and aesthetics and design. We have a belief. If I was going to attempt to critique, I say your belief could be more extreme, but I think it makes sense that, you know, we have a deluge of data and we need better ways of presenting it to make it understandable to the world. That sort of makes sense. We have a hunch, which is that there ought to be ways of therefore presenting to practitioners and others certain kinds of results from analyses that is higher impact, easier to understand, that sort of thing. And a way we could test that is to actually come up with one of these ways in a real context, show the practitioners, and see whether it improved things for them. Is that broadly right? That's great. Amazing. So obviously this is like 15 minutes work, so we're not expecting it to yet be a $1 billion company, but you can see, I hope, the sort of path from this to doing something really practical. So if you were on EF, what we would say is, okay, the bit that we really need to push on is in the hunch. It sounds like a sensible hunch to say there probably are ways to better present data. Now we need to decide what we think those ways are and actually come up with some so that we can test it. But even though this is like a 15-minute simple example, I think it starts to show how instead of sitting around waiting for a light bulb to go on above your head, you start to have a path towards something you can test. Now the key and the really important point is it doesn't matter if the test is actually the idea that we came up with or the way of presenting the visualization isn't that useful. That's fine. That's something we learned. It's a hypothesis that we test. What matters is that this process takes us in the direction of something that is more viable, rather than it being like, oh, wouldn't it be good to have Tinder but for animals, or wouldn't it be great to have Facebook but for grandmothers, or which is the kind of classic sort of like way that people come up with ideas like X for Y. This way actually leads you towards ideas where you're likely to have expertise. Thank you. That's a great example. Has anyone got one that they're willing to share? Another one?
I have one as a bad example.
A bad example. Okay.
So how this audio graph online and put that graph into the machine and get the mark out, so that it's just like print some online documents in the real time. So I had this idea for many years, and let's try to analyze this. What is the edge? I have got application in engineering, but I have no specialization in manufacturing engineering or trade all those kind of things. But one edge might be, okay, I've seen this person have done this, and I know that I can also do it, someone else can also do it. It's not going to be difficult, just as an edge to copy this. And what do I believe is that I believe that this kind of with some demand. Some people would like to have them. They're not expensive and they're quite handy. And my hunch is that just think how the printers come into our daily life. I believe with the low cost, with technology, with demand, they will be able to be realized. How can I test this? I don't really know. Probably do the prototypes and give people test.
Okay. That's a really, so it's very rare that someone says, oh, let me give you a bad example. But that's actually it's a really good example of why I believe edge-based ideation is really important, because the idea is actually really sensible, right? Like the belief that, more people, that 3D printing is going to be an important technology, that it will eventually get cheaper, that it will go into people's homes, the hunch that there might be use cases in the home, all makes sense. The challenge is, if you don't have the edge, exactly as you said, very rightly, how are you going to win? And so I thank you for sharing that. I think that's really valuable as a way of thinking about it, because I do think that it's the sort of idea that does feel right, but if you don't have an edge, how are you going to win? So yeah, great. Okay, let's stop there. We could, I'm very happy to chat if any of you have more ideas at the break. What I want to do is just walk you through the frameworks fairly quickly. This is going to be quite fast. I want to walk you through how we would think about evaluating and then validating the sorts of ideas that you start to come up with. So we kind of touched on this very, very briefly, talked about how you test these ideas. Let me show you just a few frameworks that I think might be useful in thinking about testing. So basically, we think there are two things that you need to simplify, two things that you should worry about when evaluating whether an idea is going to be a good idea. The first is how defensible it is, how hard it's going to be for other people to replicate from a technical point of view. And the second is how strong is the market? Are people actually going to want and pay for this? And if you think about these two ideas together, this gives you a framework for thinking about whether an idea is going to be viable. One, is it defensible? We probably should add the caveat there, is it defensible for you? Coming back to the idea of edge. And second, is there an interesting market application here? Is there a use case for the technology that people will actually pay for, that's valuable enough that people will pay for? So if you think about this very simply, you can imagine putting all ideas into this sort of grid where you have high application quality, don't worry, I'll explain a bit more what I mean by that, and high tech defensibility, high application quality and low tech defensibility, high tech defensibility but low application quality, and then low for each.
Yeah, you just expand on what you mean by tech defensibility.
Yes. Well, I'm going to give examples of each, okay, and hopefully it'll be clear, but let me know if at the end it isn't clear. So what do I mean by this? Good question. So let's think about what would go in that upper right-hand quadrant. So I've got an example. Let's see if you can think of one. So by high tech defensibility, what I mean is a product or a service that is hard to build and therefore hard to copy. In other words, if it turns out that you're making lots of money, which is like one, obviously, ultimate test of a product in this thing, it will be hard for other people to say, hey, I like what he's got, I'm going to do that myself. So that's what we mean by tech defensibility, something that's hard for other people to replicate quickly. On the high quality application, what we mean by that is the use that you're putting the technology to is valuable. Someone gets value from it such that they're willing to pay. Can anyone think of a product that has high tech defensibility and is a high quality application, high value application? Ta-da! So Google is a great example of high tech defensibility and high quality application. Why is it high tech defensibility? probably that's quite intuitive that, you know, even with the combined brain power in this room, if we set out to replicate a search engine over the next even year, we would struggle to replicate the quality of search results that Google or Bing or anyone else can give us. It's a very, very tough product to replicate, very, very hard. Why is it high value application? Well, because actually the ability to deliver adverts in response to what people are looking for is super valuable. Basically, what I'm saying when I type something into Google is I want to do something around what I'm typing. Therefore, serving ads against it is a really, really high value application because people are willing to pay to show those ads there. It's obviously slightly easy example in that Google's now, if not the most valuable company in the world, then in the top 2. But this is a great example. High tech defensibility, high value market application. Okay, so, and basically EF exists to try and find companies in this quadrant. And in general, I would say if you have a strong technical background, as all of you do, you should try and find companies, find startup ideas that are in this quadrant, where it's hard for other people to copy and the value is high. That might seem totally obvious, but it's amazing how many companies we have to deal with where even when you get them to put their own idea through this exercise of which of these quadrants is it in, they're like, oh, it's actually down here. So, well, let's make an easy change and put something in the top right-hand corner. Obviously, it's not quite that simple. Okay, what about one, and this is actually the most interesting case, low quality application, high tech defensibility. I think it's going to be really hard for you to come up with an example. And the reason I think it's going to be hard is that what we found at EF, having seen dozens of ideas in this quadrant, is they tend to do one of two things. Either they slide backwards into the low application, low defensibility quadrant and become just bad ideas. Why? Well, because it's a total waste of time for you to spend ages building something really, really hard that doesn't have value. So eventually you give up. So that's bad. The positive is sometimes this can be a starting point to move up to the top right-hand corner. Why? Well, because if you have something that's excellent technically, it isn't guaranteed to have a high-value application. But if you can genuinely do something new and difficult, then usually the best thing to do is not give up, but to find what is the application where this is most valuable. Let me give you a real-world example from EF that I absolutely love. This is a company called Third Eye. It was started by 2 guys who joined us, I think, a year ago, and they both had some pretty deep expertise in computer vision, in particular of sort of motion detection in video, human motion detection in video. Very clearly this was their edge. Human motion detection in video, edge, great. Their belief was that this would really transform a whole series of activities that currently require non-scalable human intervention. Seems reasonable. You know, they're basically saying if in video we can detect motion and process that digitally, then that will remove a lot of things that we do today where you need a human to watch stuff. Fair enough, sounds sensible. The application they chose, unfortunately, was not a very exciting one. Their hunch was a really great place to use this technology is in gyms, because you could have a camera set up to watch people work out, detect their motion, and then assess their workout on a scale of some sort. This hunch was bad, it turned out. It doesn't mean it's stupid, it doesn't mean that they were wrong to have it, but actually this turns out to be a very low value application. People are not really willing to pay for an assessment of their workout. They already feel they're paying enough in the gym for gym membership. They feel that getting a video assessment of their workout is nowhere near as good as having a personal trainer. So how much are they actually willing to pay for this assessment? The answer was almost nothing. But the technology was genuinely good. It was really difficult what they were doing. They had an edge in the space. So what we did was we sat down with them and said, okay, let's take the technology as a given. We've got the technology. It's good. It works. How do we move you from this low value application in gyms to a higher value application? Can anyone think of a higher value application of this sort of technology? Surveillance, yes. So these guys now, Third Eye today, works with Tesco and the co-op to do automated detection of theft based on CCTV footage. And they have trials with both those companies. They've raised a lot of funding and it's going pretty well. Why is this a high value application? Because theft costs money. And if you can reduce theft, then every time you reduce it, you save however much money was lost in that theft. Now, actually, it turns out that solving theft is a pretty huge problem and technically not yet possible. But what they can do is they can target a very, very niche case of theft, which turns out to be particularly valuable, slightly unpleasant, which is shop assistants stealing from their own cash desks. This is a really big problem. It's a very significant proportion of all theft from supermarkets. And actually, because the scope of that problem is much smaller, you literally just have to watch a cash register. You're actually able to narrow the scope of the problem. It makes it technically much more feasible. And they're now actually in the situation where they have great tech defensibility, really hard to replicate what they're doing, partly because of the data they have access to, and a high value application because theft is really, really expensive. So they've moved, I would argue, from that quadrant that was high defensibility, low value, up into the high defensibility, high value. I hope, because we're obviously investors in that. So it'd be great if that turned out to be true. Okay. What about high quality application, low tech defensibility? There actually are a lot of fairly famous companies in this space. Can anyone think of one? Pardon? Twitter, yeah, that's true. Their defensibility doesn't come from their technology. It comes from their network. The fact that 200 million people are on Twitter makes it hard to replicate, but that's a good example. I actually was thinking about a very different kind of business, Deliveroo. So many of you will have seen or used Deliveroo. For those of you who don't know, Deliveroo will deliver food from restaurants to your house, or indeed, I believe, to the Alan Turing Institute. It's a great business in lots of ways. It's raised a lot of money. It's on paper at least worth a huge amount of money. Why do I say it has low tech defensibility? Because what they're doing isn't actually hard from a technical perspective. It's actually just hard from an operational perspective. What is the implication of that? Well, I'm not trying to claim that the implication of that is that this isn't a great business, or that it's not valuable, or that it's not worth investing in. But from the kind of businesses that we build at EF, this feels like a very dangerous sort of business to get into, particularly if you have a strong technical background. Why? Well, one, you won't be making use of your edge, unless your edge is in sort of like operational excellence in delivery and logistics, but also because what happens in this sort of business where the tech defensibility is low is instead of competing on tech, you compete on operations and you compete on capital. So this company has had to raise literally hundreds of millions of dollars in the first few years of its life in order to be able to hire loads of drivers and cyclists. And even if you've never used Deliveroo, I'm sure you've seen Deliveroo motorbikes and Deliveroo bikes kind of zipping up and down Euston Road. And so they're competing with people with very deep pockets. Who's heard of Uber Eats? It's Uber's new food delivery company. And you can see little Uber Eats cycles and bicycles nipping up and down Euston Road. In fact, not only that, you often, if you order Uber Eats, it often comes on a Deliveroo bicycle because they're competing so hard to get the same drivers on board that they often drive for both and they can't remember which bike to use. I'm not joking. But this is not a great business to start if your edge is technical, because instead of competing and winning on the fact that your tech is better, you're going to have to compete on how much money can you raise and how operationally efficient can you be. Again, nothing wrong with that kind of business, but for EF and probably for you, this isn't the most attractive quadrant to be in. It's going to be a quadrant that's dominated by operations and capital raising.
If you were to take that example, what would you say Uber Eats' edge is over Deliveroo? Just their capital.
Capital is a huge one, and logistical excellence. Like, what does Uber know lots about? Like moving objects around cities is probably one. Now, I think one of the interesting questions is who has the edge. I think it's actually going to be a boon for consumers and pretty bad for both companies. So Uber Eats at the moment, for example, to give an example of how they're trying to compete, they have no minimum order threshold and no delivery charge. So the other day, Elsbeth, who works for us, ordered a box of steamed rice from one of the places for 99 pence, and it came on a bike to our office with no delivery charge. The total amount charged was 99 pence. This is not a great business to be in. Like, you do not want to be in a business where that is happening. Anyway, the point being that if you have a technical edge, use it. And then the final category, businesses in this quadrant don't last very long. If you have neither a high value application nor any technology, it's not going to last very long. So this is the quadrant that you want to move out of. But I think what you need as well is that kind of self-assessment of, am I in this quadrant right now? Is my idea in both low value and low tech? In which case, start again. Don't waste time. The opportunity cost of your time as a founder is very, very high. Okay, I now want to just spend 15 minutes before we break again, just working through this idea of how we would actually go about validating these ideas. How would we know, beyond doing this sort of intellectual assessment of which quadrant, how would we know how to validate the ideas? The single most important pair of words that you can have in your head as a technical founder of a company is customer development. Customer development. Now that might seem a really unusual phrase if you've not heard it before, but it's meant to be the counterpart to product development or technical development. And basically the idea is, for every hour that you spend developing your product, you should probably be spending 9 hours developing your customers. What do we mean by this? Basically, that when you start an idea, when you start a company, there's so much risk in there. There's risk of almost every kind imaginable. There's technical risk. Can you build it? Maybe you can't build it, in which case you're stuck. There's market risk. Does anyone want it? There's executional risk, operational risk. Can you pull off what you're trying to do? The only way to know that you're onto something is to actually get people using your product. Get people actually interacting with your idea. I think sometimes there's this popular sort of myth of startups like hiding in a garage for like 3 years until everything's absolutely perfect and then unleashing it on the world and suddenly it becomes huge. In practice, that is not how startups work at all. You do not want to, you absolutely do not want to hide what you're doing until it's perfect. Instead, you want to get what we call traction. In other words, you want to get to the point where people are using what you do and demanding more. That's how you know that the risk of people not wanting what you're spending all this time making is gradually diminishing. The worst thing that can happen to you as a founder is to spend ages on something that no one wants. Your time is really valuable. It couldn't be more devastating than to lock yourself away for ages, working on something until it's perfect and then discovering that actually no one ever was going to buy it.
Then why do they call it a stealth phase or something?
Yes, it's a good question. I'm going to come back to that. Hold that thought. The question was, why do we talk about stealth mode if you shouldn't hide? I'll come back to that. Let me try and explain a little bit though, and this is how I'll come into it, how we think about risk in startups. So very broadly, there are lots of kinds of risks, but as a crude model, you can say that there's kind of two kinds of risks. The risk that no one wants it, and so there's no money to be made anyway. Call that size of the opportunity. And then the risk that you can't actually pull off what you're trying to do. So to illustrate this, we have a very silly example. If you said, I have this great startup idea, I'm going to create a pair of wings that any human can just put on their back and then fly, that would be, how would we think about that? Well, it'd be crazy to say there's no opportunity there. There is an opportunity. Loads of people would buy that. It sounds to me like exactly the sort of thing that people would spend money on. A flying machine that you could clip onto your back. But your ability to actually pull off that idea, to execute it successfully, I believe, is probably very low. If you have an edge in human scale flying systems, and you actually have some breakthrough, then maybe it isn't, and maybe it moves into this corner. But most startups don't face that kind of risk. Most startups actually, because they start from their team's capabilities, start with a relatively high ability to execute. In other words, relatively low risk on that, and a relatively high risk around what is the size of the opportunity. Today, Google makes about $90 billion a year in revenue. 90 billion. What was the size of the market for search engines in 1998 when it first launched? Tiny. Fraction of that. Well less than 1% of that. Probably less than 0.1% of that. And therefore, really good ideas, one of the risks that they face is that no one actually knows what the size of the opportunity is. No one knows what people will want in future and how much they'll want it. In other words, how much they'll be willing to pay. And consequently, we're always trying to balance these two risks. Can you execute? Do people want it? So there are some ideas, and I'm going to say this up front because it's nearly none, but there are some ideas where there's genuinely almost no risk that people don't want it, and all the risk is whether you can do it. And those ideas generally are the ones that you want to do in stealth, where you know that if you do it, people will want it, but the danger is that someone gets there first. So for example, if you had an all-purpose general cure for cancer, I don't think you need to worry about whether there's a demand for that. People want that, for sure. If you could create a teleportation device, people want that. You don't need to worry too much about the market demand. However, if you're creating an online marketplace for staying in other people's homes and booking nights to stay in their spare room instead of in a hotel, I have almost no doubt that you have the ability to execute the first version of that. What people really wanted to know about Airbnb back in 2007 is there an opportunity here? They're very different types of risks, and they're often, but not always, negatively correlated. In other words, if something's easy, really, really easy to pull off, the big question is usually going to be whether there's actually an opportunity. It's not always true that if something's hard, it's obviously a big opportunity, but anything that's obviously a big opportunity is usually hard. And so thinking about these trade-offs is really important. However, what we find is that with the kinds of people who do EF, who are often have similar backgrounds to you, deep technical backgrounds, lots of technical expertise, in general, to stereotype, people with deep tech backgrounds tend to underestimate the market risk, the do people want to question, and overestimate the technical risk, can we build it question. In other words, 10% of businesses fail because of engineering, and 90% because they can't find people to buy it. I would say that in terms of how people choose to spend their time, they usually flip that the other way around. No, I think we need to spend another week coding. We must spend another week coding before we go talk to anyone. Actually, that's almost always not the answer. Almost always the answer is make sure you really, really understand the need of the customer. So much so that when you start to invest your time in building, you can be certain that there's demand there if you can build it. It's very, very tempting to do the opposite, but it's almost always fatal to a startup to build too much too soon. So what you really want to think about is how are you going to find and make sure you understand the needs of your customers. One of the things I liked about your idea about visualization for data scientists is you immediately talked about going to the customers and testing. I was afraid that you were going to say, and the test is, we're going to generate 1,000 different ways of presenting information and decide which one we like best and which is the best visualization. That would have been, I think, exactly the wrong approach. What you actually said, which was exactly what we would recommend at EF, is go find the users. Go find the users and find out what they want. Because so much of the risk that you bear as an entrepreneur and as a founder is in misunderstanding your customers, not in being unable to build the tech. A quick example of this, these two guys, Boris and Rashid, they did EF last year. In fact, they just started in March. They just graduated from EF. They're building a company called Calypso, which uses, again, it's another sort of computer vision company. They actually do something that sounds incredibly dull. They count cars using video. So right now, TfL employs loads and loads of people to stand by the side of the road and tick, counting cars. These guys start by automating that, and now they're moving into automating traffic monitoring through CCTV, and then they're moving into things like speeding tickets and other kind of parking violations, things like that. Now, these guys have super deep technical backgrounds. They're able to build the technology. And what they did really, really well at the beginning, the temptation would be, ooh, the tech's quite hard. Let's prove that we can build this car detection and monitoring software before we go take it to customers. That's what would have been tempting. But of course, then they'd have had to invest a lot of time up front in building that before they even knew if anyone wanted it. What they did was they took a pre-prototype version of this to TfL and people like TfL to test demand before they even knew if they could build it. It's quite a brave thing to do because it requires you to basically believe that you will be able to achieve it if there is demand there. But it paid off for them because they were able to really understand the specification that a company like, that a customer like TfL would need in order to get started. Google Books is a really interesting story. I think it's really easy to look at Google and be like, Google is this linear story of getting everything right. You know, they started with this great idea about search, they built it, and then just from there they became the biggest company in the world. That's not actually the history of Google. In fact, early on, Google had no idea how to monetize its service. It had no idea how it was going to make money from this amazing juggernaut that it built. We had this guy come in to speak at EF, a guy called Joseph O'Sullivan, fascinating guy, one of the early engineers at Google, who was put in charge of the Google Books project. And there was a time when Google believed that Google Books was going to be the way that they were going to monetize Google. So much so that he and his team spent, I can't remember the numbers, whether it was 6 months or a year, building a robot that would turn the pages of books to enable easier scanning. Eventually they worked out that it was quicker and cheaper to use interns. So they scrapped the robot to turn the pages of the book, and then they realized that Google Books wasn't how they were going to make money. But it's very, very easy to get caught up in the tech. Wouldn't it be great to have a robot that could turn the pages of these books so we could scan it? Turns out not to be an important part of the business at all. Now, I'm not trying to dump on Google. They obviously are the great winner of the last 20 years of tech startups. But it's fascinating that even in a clear winner like Google, you still see the tendency to focus too much on the technology and not enough on the customers. So how do you even go about this approach? Well, it's difficult because on the one hand, I'm telling you, you need an edge, you need a hunch, you need a vision, you need to know where you're going. On the other hand, I'm saying test, test, test. Don't trust yourself, only trust your customers. How do you reconcile those two? Our answer is this mantra, and if you ever come to EF, you would almost be bored of hearing these 4 words repeated again and again and again. Strong beliefs, weakly held. So what I'm saying when I say test things with your customers is not do whatever your customers say, just stand there and receive your instructions from your customers. What we are saying is that you use your customers as a way of validating or invalidating ideas and guesses that you have for what you might build. So you start with a strong belief, you go test it. When the evidence, e.g. your customer feedback, tells you that you're wrong, you drop it and you start again. But you need to go all in with your ideas. You can't say, oh, I've kind of got this idea and yeah, it's probably bad. You have to go in and assume that your ideas have an element of truth, but then be willing to drop them and iterate when you get negative feedback. So who should you go after? How should you test these ideas? The most important thing is to identify a group of initial customers who you think should want what you're building more than anyone else. So you want to find the highest value customers, the customers who, if what you're making is going to work, should be the most enthusiastic customers. These 2 guys, Joe and Tim, they were computer scientists from Imperial. They joined EF 2 years ago, just 3 years ago, and they built a company called Permutive, which does web personalization. So it kind of takes your reading habits and can redraw pages on the fly in order to optimize various kinds of behavior. When they were on EF, they had this great experience where they met the chief developer of a well-known online publisher who agreed to install their software and start using it. Not start paying for it, but start using it. And it was really exciting. We were, all so excited on the EF team. They were really excited. Overnight, they went from having 0 users to having 60 million users a month going through the system because this publisher had agreed to install them. Like, cool. Well, the next step is to get them to pay for it. I mean, you're obviously adding loads of value. Get the publisher to pay for it. Months passed. No check was forthcoming. No money ever came. It turned out that they'd found an enthusiastic advocate for their product in the organization, but that advocate wasn't the decision maker. That wasn't the person who had the authority to pay. And so they got really, really excited because they'd gone after the wrong person. It's very, very tempting to find the person who is enthusiastic rather than the one that will tell you the truth. In other words, you say, do you want this? Will your organization pay for this? And they're like, yeah, we absolutely love it. And it's like, cool. Well, do you want to start paying for it right now? Oh, no. I mean, that's not my decision. Actually, I can't do that. I could do a whole day-long session on this, so I'll cut it short. But the point is, when you tell people ideas, people are programmed usually to be nice, generally. Particularly in Britain, people are terrible at giving negative feedback. What do you think of my terrible idea? I think it's wonderful. I think it's absolutely amazing. How fortunate we are to have met. Great, do you want to pay for it? Oh, actually, no, I can't do that. It's not quite. Oh, sorry. One of the things that we teach people at EF to do is to follow the money. In general, if you're doing something that is in that high value application segment, by definition, that means you are creating value for them, for the customer. So if they won't pay for it at all, you really have to ask yourself whether you're actually creating value or whether they're just telling you that you're creating value. It's very, very easy to get carried away by enthusiasm, particularly at the moment. You know, tech is hot right now. Everyone's very excited about startups, about innovation, about technology. People always make time to talk to you. But the real key to knowing whether you're doing something valuable is whether people actually pay. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I want to make sure we have time for the final session. Does anyone have any questions on that whistle-stop tour of how we test ideas? So we've got idea generation with the edge-based approach. We've got validation, evaluation, thinking about high and low value applications. And then finally, we have validation of how you would go out and start asking questions to people about whether you're giving them what they actually want. Any questions?
I have like a practical question. So suppose once you get an idea, I don't know, like say in the machine learning or like data science AI scenario. So of course, I mean, you would like to deploy it before anyone else. But is it possible at all to like patent like these machine learning AI algorithms, or and if so, like what would be like the minimum requirements? So like do the companies often have an idea like patent it, or do they just like try to be dominant in the market so that no one else kind of tries to replicate what they're doing?
It's a really good question. Patents are extremely complicated, and whether they're a good idea depends. It's very contingent on what you're doing and the context. I would say, in general, patents are really helpful for things like demonstrating that what you're doing is innovative to the outside world, whether that's to investors or employees or customers. Unfortunately, for a startup, patents are very difficult to defend because the people who breach them have a lot more money than you. This is like the brutal truth of what it's like as a startup to have a patent. What that does mean is they can be very valuable to people who have more money who buy them. So often you see in acquisitions by startups, by big companies, one of the things that the big companies value is the patents. In general, a lot of EF companies file patents. We're certainly not against it. But I think it's a mistake to focus too much on defending your intellectual property at the expense of the customer piece. So again, it's sort of like a special case of what I was talking about. You can write patents all day long, but if no one wants what you're building, then all you've got is a few pieces of paper that say, hey, this guy had this novel idea before anyone else and he knows how to do it. So I think we would see patents as being one plank of a much broader commercial strategy, but it's no substitute for customer development, really understanding what people want. Shouldn't take that as legal advice, by the way. It's very much patent strategy depends on the circumstances. Yeah.
One more question. So you mentioned that it's important to like have like clear products or customers. Or like there's been some startups that seem to just be like a group of PhDs working on a cool problem. With no real application and with no real customers. I mean, I think I'll give mine, for example, right? Yeah. And then they just get like massive valuations but like no one really does what they're doing and they don't have customers and anything. So what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting question. I actually had as one of the examples, and then I removed it, DeepMind, as being high-tech defensibility, low-quality application. Not that the quality was, but they didn't have an application, really. It's a good example. And that's a very special case. It's very unusual. What they're doing is so unusual that I doubt it is a replicable strategy for most startups. Hiring a bunch of PhDs and hoping to get bought is not a strategy. I'm not saying that's what they were doing, and we've done some work with them, and they're amazing people. But I think if you're going to do that, what you need to be able to demonstrate to acquirers is that you can lock in talent at levels that mean that it's cheaper and better to buy you than to buy from you. It's interesting. One of the little known things about DeepMind, which I don't know a lot about, but I've seen in the press, is that they had for a time this sort of like fashion application, which is now hidden deep. You can only see it on like the Internet Archive because it's not on their website anymore. But it's quite interesting that they were clearly experimenting with potential use cases before they were bought by Google. I have no inside information whatsoever about this, but I suspect that they would have ended up in a conundrum where either they'd have had to keep raising more and more money and diluting and diluting and diluting their ownership, or get bought by a Google or a Facebook, or they would have to kind of find an application that did work and start to make some money. So I think there will be a category of companies, particularly in the machine learning and AI space, that do get bought having very little in the way of application. But I'm not sure it's a strategy I would set out to try at the beginning.
One more question.
Yeah.
For example, how difficult it is for a startup, for example, to compete with other companies for like human capital?
It's a great question. It's one of the things that we spend loads of time on with our portfolio companies. So the question was, how do you, as a startup, how do you compete with big companies for talent, for human capital? That's what you mean, right? Yeah. So I think you have to think, so there's no point competing with them on the traditional dimensions that people compete for talent. So it's very unlikely that you'll be able to pay more than Google. It's very unlikely that you'll be able to offer better free lunches and a more colourful working environment and slides and ball pools in the office or whatever these people do these days. So you have to think about what are the dimensions that you can compete on that are completely different. So one obvious answer is, if you were to join Google today, you'd be employee number, whatever it is, 54,320, I'm making that up, 29, right? Whereas if you are a startup of 3 people, being employee number 4 is a really different proposition in terms of autonomy, in terms of impact, in terms of the breadth of the activity that you might be doing. So that's one thing. The other is whether you can offer equity, shares of the company that are much more meaningful overall ownership than a big company can. The other thing is, kind of you haven't got any bureaucracy. There's so few of you. It may be that your mission, and this is again why I really believe that starting with a mission rather than just making money is really important. It's very important for attracting talent. So there are lots and lots of dimensions where startups can compete with big companies. And what's particularly useful is that at the start, you actually want to hire people who are attracted to those very dimensions. Because if you hire someone, it seems like I'm picking on Google. I'm not. It's just because they're so successful. They're the obvious people to mention. But if you're hiring someone and Google also want to hire them, and that person goes to Google because they really like the free food and the high salary and the kind of generous holiday policy, etc. Maybe they're not actually the right person for you to hire because they want very different things that you can't provide. So I think the key for hiring as a startup is distinctiveness. What is distinctive about you that makes you totally different from working anywhere else? You could argue, and I'm sure they'd vociferously disagree if they were here, but the difference between working at Google and working at Facebook is not that large. It's more or less the same. Whereas you can be really distinctive relative to either of those places simply by the smallness and scrappiness that a startup has. Okay, let's stop there. We're running sort of about 5-10 minutes late. So should we have just a 5-minute break, come back at 5 minutes to 4, and we'll do the final half hour on what happens to a startup. All right, so 5-minute bathroom break.
sounds like there's a lot of work for.
There is, yeah. I will not lie about that.
Yeah, do not start crazy. Like these guys is like, did they actually go to you after you finish the PhD? Yeah.
Finish the PhD generally continue working on in the area of PhD. All the space to do. So it is hard, but as a PhD student, working hard.
So it's basically like a natural progression of the ideas for the type of collection.
I think so, but my job is to help PhD students. So like I don't even I have got
Shouldn't trust me at all. I'm totally blind.
Well, it's more like it's not even so. We take lots of people. We take PhD students, we take grads, we take people registry. Like my specific thing, like very much about PhD. Sometimes postdocs, but like it's quite a niche area. So PhD is very uncommon.
What I keep thinking about the other approach is like within the context of small stuff. Yeah, you know, like companies or like you actually do have like the backing of like a big brother.
Yeah. So this is the reason why that's good is because you have access to capital. There's also key is access to data. Probably one of the most that's really good, but the problem as well is you are effectively a small company but large companies. So you've got with that becomes lots of divisions for a team. It's actually very hard. There's a lot of bureaucracy and you can get around that. By the way, you can a lot of what we do starts people were not anti-big companies. People collaborate and work with companies from the very start. One of the ways you get commitments from testers So what that allows you to do then is you can work back in their data, but you also work with someone else to get their data too.
Yeah.
So it allows you to get a kind of an industry bonded approach to
Collaborators basically could have support from startup people.
and one of the things is what we've learned lots of people lots of sell direction. And the first few months of finding the right way, testing it, finding out the people will make something that will be that. It's often in a large it's really hard to say this is not working out, we need to change it. That process is a lot slower than people coming in. So it's a lot of this. So that has a point very cheap. It's a waste of money. It's not worth it. The thing I think is a lot of bright people waste their time. A lot of very smart people who have a lot of very intelligent people surrounding them and a lot of time in their life. Very easy that I love work. So you get people then what will happen in management will say, first
How do you compare the response?
oh interesting.
What's the question, sorry?
How do we think UK and Singapore is different in terms of the response to the program?
Fascinatingly, very little. I mean, which I find totally surprising. So I spent most of September in Singapore launching the program there. Not for the wrong
Launching the program.
That was an added benefit.
Okay, so you actually just launched it this year.
Yes, we moved there. We moved there in January. We raised some money in January. Put 2 people on the ground there in January. There's now 11 of them, and the first Singapore cohort just started. one of them, so it's a bit smaller than in the UK. But I was amazed by how similar the people are, how similar the response is. And I think it's partly, although I would say this, that those trends that I talked about in the very first part of the talk, they're global. You know, like the fact that the skills give you access to scale, the fact that the costs are lower, that's global. The main difference actually is that partly because of the incentive system.
Yeah, you get some funding support from spring.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of different sort of things there. But what it means is that we have even more PhDs and postdocs in Singapore than we do in the UK. In the UK, it's about a third, and in Singapore, 50%. So it's, yeah. Okay. Actually, we should wait for. Yeah. Okay, final stretch. So I didn't used to include this part of the talk in our normal sort of intro, but I did because what I realized was that startups are one of those sort of topics, entrepreneurship, if you like, in general, is one of those topics that has a lot of jargon that gets thrown around. And I kind of, because I work in it the whole time, I kind of just assume that everyone knows what these words mean and how it works and what all the stages of a startup are. But actually, I don't think that's true at all. And so I want to give this as a very brief sort of 20-minute run through of what actually happens to a startup. When I talk about raising money, what does that mean? When I talk about VCs, what does that mean? When I talk about exits, Series A, all these words, what do they mean? So I'm just going to walk you through the startup life cycle using sort of EF as an example, because I think it probably brings it to life a bit more, to try and give you a sense of what we're talking about when you read in the tech press all these terms. What do they mean? So very broadly, to undermine everything I'm about to say, you might say that actually startup journeys are highly heterogeneous and nearly every startup has something unusual about their journey. But I think you can basically see these sort of 8 stages in the life of a company. I suppose the caveat I would say is that the first 6 stages takes about 6 months, and the other 2 probably take about 10 years. So this disproportionately weighted to the start of the story. But that's because I think this is where maybe you need the most context. So how does it work at EF? What do people actually do? What is the journey that startups go through? Well, I think even before people start a company, the most important thing they can do, given everything I've been saying about edge, is actually develop their edge. I think if you look at the history of most of the really successful companies that start as startups, if you look at the stories, the personal histories of entrepreneurs who've been very successful, what you usually see is that there's a period of their life, which could be a very short period of time, a very long period of time, during which they developed their edge. They had a competitive advantage. It's fascinating how true this is. Once you start looking for the period in which people develop their edge, you see it everywhere. So Bill Gates, the most successful entrepreneur in modern times, he got started building Microsoft because he was one of the very first people who had access to a computer. Because I can't remember the exact story, but I think his mother was involved in the first program to bring computers into schools or libraries in Seattle, where he's from. Sounds crazy, but that was his edge. He was one of the few people in the world that could have built Microsoft. And Larry Page, his edge was that he was working on information retrieval at Stanford in his PhD. So I'm not saying that you can necessarily deliberately set out to develop your edge, but I think it's worth rewinding and saying that companies become famous long after the work begins. So often things get described as overnight successes, and you realise it's actually been many thousands of nights before the overnight success happens. So the first thing I'd say is there's always a period of developing the edge. Okay, but then what actually happens? Well, nearly everyone agrees that you cannot build a startup by yourself. In fact, the idea of the solo genius entrepreneur is a complete myth, or almost entirely a complete myth. Even the most famous entrepreneurs who are known as being like solo geniuses were not solo geniuses. Bill Gates, everyone thinks of him as the solo genius behind Microsoft, but in fact he founded it with a guy called Paul Allen, who is also one of the wealthiest men in the world. Much less famous than Bill Gates, but key to its success. People like Steve Jobs, solo genius, but of course Steve Jobs started Apple with Steve Wozniak. Almost always there is a co-founding moment that is absolutely key to the journey of the company. And I would argue that this should be one of the episodes in a startup's journey that founders most focus on. Actually, if you were to ask me what is the single most valuable thing that Entrepreneur First does, I would say it gives you access to a pre-vetted pool of exceptional potential co-founders. That is probably the most important thing we do, which is kind of a bit galling given that we spend months of effort, tens of thousands of pounds developing the actual company building part of the program. But I think if you really look at the journey of startups as a whole, probably the most important bit is when they meet their co-founder. One of the challenges that there's traditionally been outside Silicon Valley is it's really hard to find co-founders because most people in Europe, in fact anywhere in the world outside Silicon Valley, don't want to start companies. They see that as a crazy thing to do. So finding a co-founder is really tough. It's one of the things that EF specializes in is building these co-founding teams. So we specialize, I suppose you might call it, in inorganic team formation. We have this process that builds teams from scratch. So if you are on EF, that's one way to build a team. If you're not on EF, then you really do need to build a team. If you ever need to raise money from external investors for your company, they'll almost always, probably it's okay to say always, require that it's not just one person working away by themselves. They want to see a team.
That's a question.
Yeah, of course.
How do you find it? How do you know who's a good team member? That's so difficult to know.
It's a really good point. So it's something. The question was, how do you know what a good team member is? How do you validate it? It's really, really hard, and I think it's really hard particularly because people go into it with exactly the wrong mental model of what they should be looking for. I would say two mistakes that people make in team building is one, trying to find someone too different from themselves. They're kind of like, oh, well, I'm the tech person, so I need a business person. That's one mistake. And the second mistake I think people make is trying to find a best friend, not a co-founder. Why are those two things mistakes? I think trying to find someone who you think covers all the bases that you don't cover sounds really attractive, but what it means is that you don't have enough of a common foundation on which to generate an idea and a working relationship. I actually think that homogeneity at the start of a team, at least in terms of skills and interests and values, is really, really, really important. So one thing when we started EF, it was less focused on pure tech. It was about 50-50 in year one between people with tech backgrounds and people without. And that didn't work anything like as well, partly because it was really hard for people to share a passion for an idea because they didn't have the common experience that led them to be excited about the same things. So I would recommend finding someone who actually, you should actually, of course you should have complementary skills, of course you should have strengths and weaknesses, but I think you don't need to go find someone who has a totally different skill set from you. There's no reason why two people with data science background shouldn't start a company together. So that's the first thing. Second thing is you're not picking a best friend, you're not picking a spouse, you're not picking a lifelong companion. You're picking someone who's going to make you successful and that you're going to make them successful. So when you take that together, the number one rule we have at EF, and again it's sort of a mantra that we repeat, is a good team is a productive team. And actually the inverse is true as well. An unproductive team is never a good team, even if you are best friends. So even if he's like, yeah, that's the person I would want to go and grab a beer with or grab a coffee with, they're absolutely my best mate. Unless you're making each other productive, it's not a good team. So the best way, if you believe that, the best way to test a team is to actually get started. I think a common mistake is to treat team formation like dating. Try lots of people, grab a coffee, talk about what ideas you're interested in, and then pick the person who's best. That doesn't work at all. Believe me, we tried that. The only way is to commit. Again, go back to that mantra, strong beliefs weakly held. Assume that the person could be a good fit. Try building something together. See what that experience is like. Do you make each other more productive or less productive? If you make each other more productive, keep going until either you're convinced or you don't make each other more productive. and then stop. That's what actually happens at EF. We encourage people to try teams as though they were going to succeed, and then take stock every week and say, am I being productive? A great team makes you more productive. That's my experience as well as I think the experience of a lot of the founders on the app. So once you've got that team, that's when you need to start generating some hypotheses. All you should be doing early on is testing. One of the kind of godfathers of entrepreneurship education is a guy called Steve Blank. He actually was the guy who came up with that term customer development. And he has this great phrase, which is great because it's A, true, and B, memorable, which is none of the answers are in the building. None of the answers are in the building. All the answers are outside the building. So if you're building something and you want to know whether it's a good idea, you can't figure that out by starting with a blank sheet of paper or a whiteboard and like figuring it out. Go ask people, go talk to people. The whole essence of customer development is that the biggest risk you face is that people might not want what you're building. If that's the case, the key is to go out and test your hypotheses. So if your hypothesis is, we have this new way of visualizing data that's going to be really valuable to data science practitioners, the key isn't to stand at a whiteboard until you've proven that to yourself. The key is to go speak to some data science practitioners and start to generate these hypotheses. Once you start to do this, what you should find is the people you're testing the hypotheses with, the people that you're developing relationships with, ought to become the natural group of initial customers. Most people wait too long to try and sell something. Most people are, and again, maybe it's particularly a British thing, are really embarrassed to the idea that you would actually try and ask people for money. But actually, finding the initial set of customers is another key moment in the journey of a startup. I would say it's one of the moments where startups go from feeling almost like make-believe or a game into something really serious and a reality. Find those initial customers. If what you're doing is valuable enough, they'll be excited to talk to you. You should be doing something that's so valuable that they're like, please let me pay for it. Let me have it. Maybe that sounds silly, but definitely my experience of our most successful companies at EF is they're the ones whose customers were most desperate to get what they're having. Again, the reason I put this as a separate step along the way is I really do think you see a change in entrepreneurs when they go from having an idea to having customers. They become almost different people. Then get building. Deliberately put this after the find the customers. There is no point building something for imaginary customers. Imaginary customers don't have preferences. It's very hard to build what they want. You should really only start doing the main chunk of the building once you actually know who you're building it for. And this period of time of building could be a very short one. It could be something that takes a couple of weeks, or it could be something that you have to iterate over a period of several years. The point is you don't start building until you really know what people want. There will come a point, at EF it's after 6 months, and outside EF it will vary hugely, where you feel pretty confident about your hypothesis about how you're going to be valuable. You feel pretty confident about who your initial customers are. You feel pretty confident about what you're making for them, and now you need to get it into their hands. And usually at that stage, the challenge that a startup faces is that there's probably 2 of you, and there's more work than 2 people can do if you're going to move at the pace that's needed to deliver what you need to your customers. Given that, you're going to need to hire some people. Or even if you don't need to hire some people, you might have to pay something to reach your customers, some sort of marketing costs. The trouble is, by definition, you haven't got any money coming into the business yet because you haven't got a product yet. So you're in this kind of catch-22 where you need money to grow, but in order to get money, you need to have grown. So how do you solve that problem? Well, fortunately, there exists an entire industry that's dedicated to providing money to companies that haven't yet sold anything. And that industry is called venture capital. Now, venture capital actually describes a very wide range of investors, from individuals investing a few thousand of their own money personally, right through to big institutions that might manage billions of dollars of funding and write huge checks to fund companies. But the point is there are people out there whose job it is to find high potential companies that they can invest in. And the bet they're making is that they can find one of the very small number of companies that becomes super valuable. So if you had invested £1,000 in the first round of funding that Uber raised back in 2009, I believe that that money today would be worth something in the region of £20 million in 7 years. Better return than you can get in your current account anyway. Now, the hard thing for these investors is that they lose money on maybe as many as 90% of the investments that they make. So they need that 10th one to pay off. Well, if it pays off 10 times, then they'll break even, right? So really, because of the risk they're taking, they typically need to return about 3 times the money they invest over a 10-year period in order for it to feel like it was worth the risk. And that's true whether they're investing their own money. We call those people angel investors. I think it's somewhat self-aggrandizing name to give yourself that, hey, I'm going to write checks to companies in the hope of making myself rich, so I'm going to call myself an angel. Or they might be from funds, venture capital funds, but either way, they're looking for very, very high returns for their money. The reason I'm emphasizing that is some businesses just cannot generate the kinds of returns that those investors need in order for it to make sense. So if you go to an angel investor and say, I can double your money in 5 years, that might sound good relative to putting your money in a current account, but the angel investor is going to say, sorry, that's not good enough. Angel investors are really looking to see 10, 20, 30, 50 times returns, ideally more. Now, what do they get in exchange? Well, they literally get shares in your company. So typically, the first round of funding we call a seed round, and typically angel investors or venture capital funds, they want to own about 20% of your company, 25% of your company after the seed round. It's quite a lot to give away. That means that one day if someone buys that company or it becomes a public company, those investors get that chunk of the money that's paid. So they might invest. So we talk about the valuation that they invest at. And that simply means the price that they pay for those shares. The bet they're making is that the valuation that they pay today will be many times smaller than the price that someone ultimately pays for the company. So, you know, if someone talks about investing at a £2 million valuation, what they mean is that the price that they pay per share is equivalent to if the whole company was worth £2 million. What they hope is that in 5 years' time, you can sell it for £100 million and it'll be worth 50 times more. So it's a bit more complicated than that because probably new shares have been issued in that time, so you wouldn't quite get 50 times your money back. But that's exactly what these first investors are looking for. It's also what EF does. EF invests in every company that comes through. We make money in exactly the same way that they make money. We take a much smaller percentage. We actually only take an 8% share of the company. But our goal is to hope that the companies that we invest in are one day much more valuable than they were at the time that we invested. And just like normal venture capital investors, a lot of our companies are going to fail too, so we need the returns to be really, really big. Fortunately, these days, there's lots of ways to raise money that are less traditional, that are more innovative. So it used to be that basically you had to find rich friends, rich family, or kind of rich people used to say fools. The joke used to be that the 3 Fs of angel investing were friends, family, and fools. And you know, they would write you checks because they had nothing better to do with all their vast amounts of cash. That's still somewhat true. A lot of early stage investing in the UK is done by individuals, but increasingly there are more innovative ways of organising investors. So there's a company called AngelList, which is basically a social network for investors. It's like LinkedIn or Facebook, but for angel investors. And they all gather on there and they look at opportunities together and decide to invest in them. And that's massively increased how easy it is to find these people, organisations like AngelList. There's also tons and tons and tons of venture capital funds that have been created to pool together money to invest in startup companies. Here are a few of the funds that have invested in companies that we've helped build at EF. Some of the famous ones, maybe Balderton Capital, Y Combinator, Index Ventures. These are funds that exist to write funding into the early rounds of companies. It's very easy to find these people. They have websites, and in general, they want to hear from entrepreneurs. That's their job. I think sometimes when you've not worked a lot with investors before, they seem like magical beings who it must be really extraordinary to have a chunk of their time, but actually they're just people and it's their job to invest in companies. So generally they really want to speak to people. Of course, once you've raised the money, you actually have to get on with the hard work of building the company. And this is where the vast majority of the work goes. I've compressed it into a single bullet point because each company is so different. But the glamorous bits of entrepreneurship are the bits that the kind of press writes about are often when you either raise financing, raise the funding, or sell the company. But the bit that actually is the work is the unglamorous part. It's the bit where you actually have to sell stuff to your customers and improve the product and hire people and build the organization. All the bits that seem like totally, perhaps, depending on what you're interested in, boring, like HR and accounting. This is the actual stuff of building the company. And you often hear about amazing outcomes, young people becoming millionaires, but most of the time that has happened only because of a huge amount of work that's gone on behind the scenes, often over many, many, many years. And so this is the unglamorous but real part of the journey. And it's amazing how often you have to just grind out results. It's very often stressful and tiring, hard work, not much fun, poorly paid. And if it feels like I'm really not selling it very well, it's because that is the reality of startups. I would argue that it's even so more rewarding than many other opportunities, but no one should ever get into startups for an easy life. It's definitely not. Hopefully, if you're working on your edge and doing something that you care about, this part is rewarding even when it's not fun. But there's no doubt that there is a lot of grinding out to do in the world of startups. The most glamorous bit, the bit that gets all the attention, is what's called the exit. That probably seems like a really weird word if you're not familiar with startups and venture capital. The reason it's called the exit is actually because that's actually a venture capital view of the journey. The reason venture capitalists call it an exit is because, unlike if you wanted to buy shares in Tesco, you could buy them today and sell them tomorrow. In fact, you could buy them today at 3 o'clock and sell them at 3:01. In venture capital, you cannot sell your shares, not very easily. In fact, if you buy shares in a private company, there is no easy way to sell them. Even if you think they've become much more valuable, usually there is no market for buying and selling shares in private companies. And that means that from a venture capitalist point of view, or from an angel investor's point of view, their money is locked up in that company. And it's locked up until there is an exit. And that's why it's called an exit, because it's when they get their money out of the company. Broadly, there are only two kinds of exits. I suppose there is a third kind, which is failure. But failure, you don't get your money back, so it doesn't really feel like an exit. Unfortunately, failure happens a lot. Many startups fail. Many startups, even that looked like they were going to succeed, fail. And failure is not a lot of fun. It's not a lot of fun for investors. They lose their money, and it's even less fun for founders. They lose their baby that they had been working on for many years. Fortunately, as I said right at the beginning, the reputational costs of failure are very, very low these days. And actually the financial costs are too, because founders aren't generally expected to sink their entire life savings into a company. But you probably have worked for a long time on not particularly high salaries. And so failure is always sad. There are many prominent examples. There was a company that people got very excited about called Groove Shark that was like an online DJ platform, I think. That raised a lot of money and then it failed. There was a company that was very hyped a few years ago called Wideplan, which was like an app for going out in London. At one point it was going to be the next big thing, and they just announced the other day that they basically had failed. They technically sold the company, but they sold it for way less money than they'd raised, so no one got any money out. So failure is the reality of startups. It does happen, and anyone who tells you that there's no risk of failure has no idea what they're talking about. Fortunately, it's not all about failure. There are also some really positive exits. And there are really two kinds of positive exit. One is what we call acquisitions, where company is bought by another company. One example would be Skype. Skype, actually, I used an example because it seems to have managed to sell itself multiple times. First, it sold itself to eBay for, I think, a couple of billion. And then eBay sold it to a group of investors who then sold it to Microsoft for $8 billion. So Skype is being passed around like a, I don't know what a fair analogy would be. I was going to say like an unwanted present, but that's not fair. Microsoft paid a lot of money for it. Skype, the investors and employees and founders of Skype made a lot of money when it was sold because eBay paid for it. eBay bought that company. Someone already mentioned DeepMind. DeepMind was a company that Google paid, I think, 400 million for. So again, the founders and investors in that got paid. Their shares were worth something when that company paid. There's a couple of EF examples that I'll come to right at the end where the company got bought and people made money. The really big companies, though, the truly huge outcomes happen when the company isn't bought by another company, but instead it becomes a public company, meaning that, like Tesco, you can buy and sell the shares on the public markets. The most famous, we call this an IPO, initial public offering. It means that the shares are being offered to the public. And this is the ultimate goal for a venture capitalist, is to see their investments become public companies. For many founders, it's the ultimate goal is to become a public company, because that's the way that, historically anyway, you achieve independence. If you're a public company and you're profitable, then typically that means that you can run that company independently for a very long time. The obvious, most successful recent example was Facebook. Facebook's a public company. If you think Facebook is going to be even more successful in future than it is now, you can go buy shares today of Facebook online. And what this means is, because it's now possible to buy and sell shares, all those venture capitalists who bought shares in Facebook were able to sell them to the public. We say the public, it's actually mainly pension funds, mutual funds, insurance companies, as well as individual investors. So it's a really great thing when a company goes public for everyone involved, because usually they do, to go back to where we started, they make a lot of money. But it also does tend to somewhat guarantee the company's independence. We had our first big exit this summer, Magic Pony Technology. This is Rob and Zihan. Rob was an electronics engineer from Imperial, and Zihan had a PhD in medical imaging from Imperial, and they built Magic Pony, which was basically using machine learning techniques to radically improve compression and upscaling in video. Twitter paid a lot of money for that, and therefore they got paid. All the investors, including EF, got paid. All their employees got paid, and that's a great outcome for everyone. Now, for them to turn down that money and try and make it a public company would have been a very difficult decision. And often it's said that if you look at all the many things that Mark Zuckerberg's got right about Facebook, perhaps the biggest one was turning down $1 billion for Facebook very early on. I think when he was 23 years old, he turned down $1 billion for Facebook, which is a pretty extraordinary decision. But of course, Facebook today is worth over $200 billion. So it was probably the right call, but a pretty brave one. We've had two other exits this year. A company called Represent, AEF, was sold to another company for about just under $100 million. And another multiple tens of millions exit was called Avocarrot. I think the number's not public, so I probably shouldn't say it. Going too far. These companies basically were bought, which means their founders either stay with the company or move on. We have lots of other companies in the data science space at EF that I hope we'll get exits from one day. And in the last couple of minutes, I'm just going to tell you about a couple that I think are particularly interesting as examples of how people with backgrounds like yours can find high quality applications for the work that you're doing. This company, Tractable, started by Alex and Razvan. Alex was again at Imperial, Razvan was at Cambridge. Tractable uses deep learning to automate the processing of car insurance claims. So it takes images of cars that have been in accidents and automates the assessment of how much damage has been done, how much it will cost to fix, what's needed to fix it. As you can imagine, this is a very valuable, high-value application for the insurance company because, one, it saves a lot of human effort, but also it radically reduces the amount of time that's needed for the car to be in the garage, which is obviously really helpful. So that company started with us 2 years ago, or rather we helped them build that 2 years ago. They didn't know each other before EF. They've raised about $2 million of funding, and they're now in the phase where they're growing very fast and working with some of the biggest insurance companies in the world. So that's very exciting. They're hopefully a long way from an exit. I say hopefully because, as I say, it usually takes 6 or 7 years to become a public company, which would be really nice. And then another one, again, with people with similar backgrounds to you guys. This is Andreas and Alessis, who were both grad students at Edinburgh. And they are working on using elements of data science to build a new kind of biometric security. So they think passwords are stuck in the last century, and there's lots of interesting ways to add additional security. So, for example, one of their products takes the classic PIN entry on a smartphone, and instead of just looking at what PIN is entered, they look at how it's entered. So what are the behavioral patterns of how you type a number? So if your password is 1234 and my password is 1234, there's probably a distinctively Matt way of typing that and a distinctively you way of typing that. And they use their technology to assess that and add additional security through that method. Again, sort of PhD students who took the technology where they had an edge and applied it. So to conclude, because we're nearly out of time, I think there are going to be absolutely enormous opportunities for people with very strong data science backgrounds to build very exciting companies over the next decade. I think that will involve taking cutting edge technology and applying it to high value applications. I think there has never been more appetite among people to do that, but also there's never been more appetite among investors to fund that. There are literally billions of dollars sitting waiting to invest in companies that can solve big problems using the techniques that you're expert in. It is hard, it is often extremely challenging, but I think it is ultimately extremely rewarding. And I also think that, and it's not just EF, but I'd like to think we've played some small part in this, there is increasingly a set of methodologies that can reduce risk, can make it easier and more straightforward to actually go through the steps required to build a successful technology company. So I hope that today has been interesting as a very brief, as I say, whistle-stop introduction to how to start startup. I'm sorry if you're bored of my voice. I've been trying to drink lots of water so I don't go totally hoarse by the end. But before we close, are there any questions on anything I've said?
What sort of dilemma people go when they receive exit options?
What are the dilemmas?
How do they decide that, okay, I should quit?
I'm going to sit down. I think it depends very much on the person. There's a sense in which you might argue that Mark Zuckerberg was never going to say yes to an acquisition offer because he believed, as it turned out rightly, that Facebook could be a world-leading company, and he wanted to be independent and he didn't want to go work at wherever it was, Yahoo, or I think it was Yahoo that offered the money. So I think one dilemma is, what kind of company do you want to lead? What kind of life do you want to have? Again, I have no sort of inside knowledge of any of the Google examples, but if you look at DeepMind, that's quite an interesting example. So obviously DeepMind was offered a lot of money, which the founders presumably decided to accept. What's interesting there is they've clearly been able to carve out at Google this role for themselves as at the forefront of AI, and all the AlphaGo stuff has obviously been huge, and they've been able to do that within Google. So one of the arguments that they might make, I assume, is that actually for them it wasn't such a huge dilemma, because what really mattered to them was taking the product and the technology to the next level, and to do that they needed Google scale resources. So I think it depends a lot on the context. Money is certainly one dimension, and if you're relatively young and you stand to make $10 million, that's a huge amount of money, and most people would really need to think about, well, at that point it becomes less about money and more about what do you want to do. But the dilemmas will vary from person to person and from context to context. I think it'd be very different, for example, being bought by Google and being bought by, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a really traditional boring company, but maybe it's better that I don't name a boring company, but insert your favorite boring company here, because that would be a very different dynamic. One thing I would say is it's very, very standard. Almost always the founders have to stay at the company that buys them for a period of time. And often that period of time is quite long, several years. And that's written into the contract when the company's bought. So it says, oh, I'll pay you 50 million for the company if the founders agree to stay for 3 years. And if they don't, they would lose a proportion of the money that they would make. So the other dilemma that founders have to think is, do I want to go work for this company that's going to buy me? Any other questions? Yeah.
Are there any important skills which yes, PhD students not pick up by default, graduate school, but
well, one of our theses is that the hardest skills to pick up quickly are deep technical skills. So one of our kind of, I suppose, kind of beliefs is that it's much easier to teach someone with a data science PhD how to be a business person than to teach a business person how to develop the skills needed that you learn in a data science PhD. I think there are skills that it's very important to learn as a founder, but I think most of these are best taught by doing rather than learning. I mean, I was a management consultant at one of the world's kind of best known management consultancies. I have a management degree from one of the world's best known universities, but I've learned way more about business, running a business, than I ever did doing those other things. The things that we think are most important at the very early stage, we teach. So one is how to tell a story. So much of founding a company is about storytelling. You have to tell stories to investors to get them excited. You have to tell stories to employees to get them excited. You have to tell stories to customers about why they need what you're selling. Communication is really, really important. And it's certainly true that some people start the EF journey as better or worse communicators. But if you go look at our demo day, which is the day that ends the program where everyone pitches for 3 minutes to some of the world's top investors, 300 of them in a room, you'll see that every single individual absolutely nails it. And that's because we teach them how to do it. Any other questions? Great. Well, thank you so much for your time. I hope it's been valuable. I hope it's been interesting. I don't know if apparently you can follow me on Twitter, which would be great because Alice, my co-founder, has way more followers than me, and it's not fair. Or if you have any questions, you want to follow up on any of this, feel free to email me. I'm just Matt, M-A-T-T, @joinef.com. More than happy to chat to you, as I'm sure Jack and Elspeth are. We think that what you're doing here is super exciting. We've worked quite closely with some of the academics that have been involved in the ATI since the beginning. Zubin, who many of you know, is one of our advisors. It's actually very involved in the company Tractable that I was just showing you. So we're super excited about what you're doing. If we can ever be helpful to you as you kind of go through the journey you're on now, let us know whether or not that's about building a company. And if when you do finish your PhD, you think maybe now is the time for me to do something entrepreneurial, then that is literally what we exist to help with. So thanks so much. Really appreciate you taking your time.